you've kind of implied that you have a sense, again, hypothesis, theorizing, that the universe is deterministic. What's your thoughts about free will? Do you think of the universe as deterministic in the sense that it's unrolling a particular, like it's operating under a specific set of physical laws, and when you have set the initial conditions, it will unroll in the exact same way in our particular line of the universe every time?
That is a very useful way to think about the universe. It's done us well. It's brought us to the moon. It's brought us to where we are today, right? Yeah. I would not say that I believe in determinism in that kind of an absolute form. Or actually, I just don't care. Maybe it's true, but I'm not going to live my life like it is.
What, in your sense, because you've studied kind of how we humans think of the world. You mentioned free will. You haven't talked to Sam. I would love to hear that conversation, actually. But
with Sam Harris?
With Sam Harris, yeah. So he talks about free will quite a bit. What's the connection between free will and consciousness to you? So if consciousness permeates all matter, the experience, the feeling like we make a choice in this world, like our actions are results of a choice we consciously make, to use that word loosely. What to you is the connection between free will and consciousness, and is free will an illusion or not?
Good question. So I think we need to be a lot more agnostic about free will than about consciousness, because I don't think we have the kind of certainty of the existence of free will that we do have in the consciousness case. It could turn out that free will is an illusion. It could be that it feels as though we're free when we're really not. Whereas, I think the idea that nobody really feels pain, that we think we feel pain, but we do, that's a lot harder to make sense of. However, what I do feel strongly about is I don't think there are any good either scientific or philosophical arguments against the existence of free will. And I mean strong free will in what philosophers call libertarian free will, in the sense that some of our decisions are uncaused. So I very much do disagree with someone like Sam Harris, who thinks there's this overwhelming case. I just think it's non-existent. I think it's ultimately an empirical question, but as we've already discussed, I just don't think we know enough about the brain to establish one way or the other at the moment.
But we can build up intuitions. First of all, as a fan of Sam Harris, as a fan of yours, I would love to just listen.
Yeah.
Well, Speaking about terminology, so one thing it would be beautiful to watch. Here's my prediction: what happens with you and Sam Harris? You talk for 4 hours, and Sam introduced that episode by saying it was ultimately not as fruitful as I thought, because here's what's going to happen: you guys are going to get stuck for the first 3 hours talking about one of the terms and what they mean. Sam is so good at this. I think it's really important, but sometimes you get stuck. Like, what does he say? Put a pin in that. He really gets stuck on the terminologies, which rightfully you have to get right in order to really understand what we're talking about. But sometimes you can get stuck with them for the entire conversation. It's a fascinating dance, the one we spoke to in philosophy. If you don't get the terms precise, you can't really be having the same conversation. But at the same time, it could be argued that it's impossible to get terms perfectly precise and perfectly formalized. So then you're also not going to get anywhere in the conversation. So it's a funny dance where you have to be both rigorous and every once in a while just let go, and then go back to being rigorous and formal, and then every once in a while let go. It's the difference between mathematics, the maths, and the poetry. Anyway,
I'm a big fan of Sam Harris. I think we're on the same page in terms of consciousness. I think pretty much. I'm not saying he's a panpsychist, but in our understanding of the hard problem. But yeah, I think maybe we could talk about free will without being too dragged down in the terminology. But I don't know.
You said we need to be open-minded, but you could still have intuitions about. So Sam Harris has a pretty sort of counterintuitive, and for some reason it gets people really riled up, a view of free will that it's an illusion, or it's not even an illusion. Like it's not that the experience of free will is an illusion. Is he argues that we don't even experience any like there's to say that we even have the experience is incorrect. That there's not even an experience of free will. It's pretty interesting that claim, and it feels like you can build up intuitions about what is right and not. You know, there's been some kind of neuroscience, there's been some cognitive science and psychology experiments to sort of see, you know, what is the timing and the origin of the desire to make an action, and when that action is actually performed, and how you interpret that action being performed, how you remember that action, like all the stories we tell ourselves, all the neurochemicals involved in making a thing happen, all of it. What's the timing, and how does that connect with us feeling like we decided to do something? And then, of course, there's the more philosophical discussion about is there room in a material view of the world for an entity that somehow disturbs the determinism of physics?
Yeah.
And those are all very precise questions. It's nice. It feels like free will is more amenable to like a physics mechanistic type of thinking than is consciousness, to really get to the bottom of. It feels like if it was a race, if we're at a bar and we're betting money, it feels like we'll get to the bottom of free will faster than we will to the bottom of consciousness.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the comparison. Yeah, so there are different arguments here. I mean, so one argument I've heard Sam Harris give that's pretty common in philosophy is this sort of thought that we can't make sense of a middle way between a choice being determined by prior causes and it just being totally random and senseless, like the random decay of radioactive isotope or something. So I think there was a good answer to that by the philosopher Jonathan Lowe, who's not necessarily very well known outside academic philosophy, but is a hugely influential figure. I think one of the best philosophers of recent times. He sadly died of cancer a few years ago. Actually spent almost all of his career at Durham University, where I am. So it was one reason it was a great honor to get a job there. But anyway, his answer to that was, what makes the difference between a free action and a totally senseless random event is that free choice involves responsiveness to reasons. So again, we were talking about this earlier. If I'm deciding whether to take a job in the US or to stay in the UK, I weigh up considerations, different standard of life maybe, or being close to family or cultural difference. I weigh them up and I, edge towards a decision. So I think that is sufficient to distinguish it. We're hypothetically supposing, trying to make sense of this idea, not saying it's real, but that could be enough to distinguish it from a senseless act. It's not a senseless random occurrence because the free decision involved responsiveness to reasons. So I think that just answers that particular philosophical objection. So what is the middle way between determined by prior causes and totally random? Well, there's a choice that's not determined by prior causes, but is not just random because the decision essentially involved responsiveness to reasons. So that's the answer to that. And I think actually that kind of thought also, I think you were hinting at the famous Libet experiments where he got his subjects to perform some kind of random action of pressing a button and then note the time they decided to press it, quote unquote, and then he's scanning their brains, and he claims to have found that about half a second before they consciously decided to press the button, the brain is getting ready to perform that action. So he claimed that about half a second before the person has consciously decided to press the button, the brain has already started the activity that's going to lead to the action. And then later people have claimed that there's a difference of maybe 7 to 10 seconds. I mean, there are all sorts of issues with these experiments. But one is that as far as I'm aware, all of the quote-unquote choices they've focused on are just these totally random, senseless actions, like just pressing a button for no reason. And I think the kind of free will we're interested in is free choice that involves responsiveness to reasons, weighing up considerations. And those kind of free decisions might not happen like at an identifiable instant. You might, when you're weighing it up, should I get married? Should I, you might edge slowly towards one side or the other. And so it could be that maybe the Libet, I think there are other problems with the Libet stuff, but maybe they show that we can't freely choose to do something totally senseless, whatever that would mean. But that doesn't show we can't freely, in this strong libertarian sense, respond to considerations of reason and value. To be fair, it would be difficult to see what kind of experiment we could set up to test that. But just because we can't yet set up that kind of experiment, we shouldn't, pretend we know more than we do. So yeah, so for those reasons, the third consideration you raise is different again. This is the debate I have with Sean Carroll. Would this conflict with physics? I just think we don't know enough about the brain to know whether there are causal dynamics in the brain that are not reducible to underlying chemistry and physics. And so then Sean Carroll says, well, that would mean physics is wrong. So he focuses on the core theory, which is the name for standard model of particle physics plus the weak limit of general relativity. So, we can't totally bring quantum mechanics and relativity together, but actually the circumstances in which we can't bring them together are just in situations of very high gravity. For example, when you're about to go into a black hole or something. Actually, in terrestrial circumstances, we can bring them together in the core theory. And then Sean wants to say, well, we can be very confident that core theory is correct. And so if there were libertarian free will in the brain, the core theory would be wrong. And okay, this is something I'm not sure about, and I'm still thinking about, and I'm learning from my discussion with Sean, but I'm still not totally clear why. It could be, suppose we did discover strong emergence in the brain, whether it's free will or something else. Perhaps what we would say is not that the core theory is wrong, but we'd say the core theory is correct in its own terms, namely capturing the causal capacities of particles and fields, but then it's a further assumption whether they're the only things that are running the show. Maybe there are also fundamental causal capacities associated with systems, and then if we discover this strong emergence, then when we work out what happens in the brain, we have to look to the core theory, the causal capacities of particles and fields, and we have to look to what we know about these strongly emergent causal capacities of systems, and maybe they co-determine what happens in the system. So I don't know whether that makes sense or not, but I mean, the more important point, that's in a way a kind of branding point, how we brand this. The more important point is we just don't know enough about the workings of the brain to know whether there are strongly emergent causal dynamics, whether or not that would mean we have to modify physics, or maybe just we think physics is not the total story of what's running the show, but we just, if it turned out empirically that everything's reducible to underlying physics and chemistry, sure, I would drop any commitment to libertarian free will in a heartbeat. It's an empirical question. Maybe that's why, as you say, it in principle is easier to get a grip on. But we're a million miles away from being at that stage.
Well, I don't know if we're a million miles. I hope we're not, because one of the ways I think to get to it is by engineering systems. So
yeah,
my hope is to understand intelligence by building intelligent systems, to understand consciousness by building systems that, let's say, the easy thing, which is not the easy thing, but the first thing, which is to try to create the illusion of consciousness. Through that process, I think you start to understand much more about consciousness, about intelligence. And then the same with free will. I think those are all tied very closely together, at least from our narrow human perspective. And when you try to engineer systems that interact deeply with humans, that form friends with humans, that humans fall in love with and they fall in love with humans, then you start to have to try to deeply understand ourselves, to try to deeply understand what is intelligence in the human mind, what is consciousness, what is free will. And I think engineering is just another way to do philosophy.
Yeah, no, I certainly think there's a role for that, and it would be an important consideration if we could seemingly replicate in an artificial way the ability to choose. That would be a consideration in thinking about these things. But there's still the question of whether that's how we do it. Mm-hmm. So even if we could replicate behavior in a certain way in an artificial system, it's not, until we understand the workings of our brains, it's not clear that's how we do it. And as I say, the kind of free will I'm interested in is where we respond to reasons, considerations of value. How would we tell whether a system was genuinely grasping and responding to facts about value, or whether they were just replicating, giving the impression of doing so? I don't know even how to think about that.
On the process to building them, I think we'll get a lot of insights.
Yeah.
And once they become conscious, what's going to happen is exactly the same thing as happening in chess now, which is once the chess engines far superseded the capabilities of humans just kind of forgot about them, or they used them to help them out to study and stuff. But we say, okay, let the engines be, and then we humans will just play amongst each other.
Right.
So just like dolphins and hamsters are not so concerned about humans except for a source of food. They do their own thing and let us humans launch rockets into space and all that kind of stuff. They don't care. I think we'll just focus on ourselves. But in the process of building intelligent systems, conscious systems, I think we'll get a deeper understanding of the role of consciousness in the human mind, and like what are its origins? Is it the base layer of reality? Is it strongly emergent phenomena of the brain? Or just as you sort of brilliantly put here, it could be both. Like they're not mutually exclusive.
Dealing with consciousness needs to be an interdisciplinary task. We need, philosophers, neuroscientists, physicists, engineers replicating these things artificially, and all needs to be working in step. And I'm quite interested. I mean, a lot more and more scientists get in touch with me, actually, saying that was one of the great things about, I think, that's come from writing a popular book, is not just getting the ideas out to a general audience, but getting the ideas out to scientists. Mm-hmm. And I've had scientists get in touch saying, this in some way connects to my work. And I would like to kind of start to put together an interdisciplinary network of scientists and philosophers and engineers, perhaps, interested in a panpsychist approach. And because I think so far panpsychism has just been sort of trying to justify its existence. And that's important. But I think once you just get on with an active research program, that's when people start taking it seriously, I think.
So if that's not the case, and you have these simple particles that at the macro level emerges some interesting stuff like consciousness. Another thing you write about in the Until the End of Time book is the thing that it seems to emerge at the macro level is the feeling like there's a free will, like we decide to do stuff. And you have a really interesting take here, which is, no, there's not a free will. I'm just going to speak for you and then you can correct me. No, there's not a free will, but there is an experience of freedom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I really love. So where does freedom come from if we don't have any kind of physics-based free will?
Yeah. And so the idea follows naturally from all that we've been talking about. Let's make the assumption that all there is in the physical universe is stuff governed by laws. We may not have those laws, may not know what the fundamental stuff is yet, but everything we know in science points in the direction that it's physical stuff governed by universal laws. And that being the case, or that being the assumption, then you come to a particular collection of those ingredients called the human being. And that human being has particles that are fully governed by physical law. And when you then recognize that every thought that we have, every action that we undertake is just the motion of particles. When I'm thinking thoughts right now, of course, at this level of description, it is the motion of particles cascading down various neurons inside of my head and so on. And every single one of those motions, collectively and individually, is fully governed by these laws that we perhaps don't have yet, but we imagine one day we will. That leaves no opportunity for any kind of freedom to break free from the constraint of physical law. And that is the end of the story. Mm-hmm. So the traditional intuitive notion of free will, that we're the ultimate authors of our actions, that we're where the buck stops, that there is no antecedent that is the cause for our deciding to go left or right, choose vanilla or chocolate, live or die, that intuitive sensation does not have a basis in our understanding of the physical world. Mm-hmm. So that's the end of the free will of the traditional sort. But then your question is, what about this other kind of freedom I talk about? And the other kind of freedom, if you focus on it intently, I think is actually the true version of freedom that we feel. And that freedom is this. You look at inanimate objects in the world, rocks, bottles of water, whatever, they have a very limited behavioral repertoire. Why? Their internal organization is too coarse for them to do very much, right? You try to have a conversation with a glass of water, you send sound waves, it doesn't do much. It may vibrate a little bit, but the repertoire of responses are incredibly limited. Mm-hmm. The difference between us and a rock or a bottle of water is that our inner organization, by virtue of eons of evolution by natural selection, is so refined, so spectacularly ordered, that we have a huge repertoire of behaviors that are finely attuned to stimuli from the external world. You ask me a question, that's a stimulus, and all of a sudden, these particle processes go into action, and this is the result, this answer that I'm giving you. So the freedom that we have is not from the control of physical law. Mm-hmm. The freedom that we have is from the constrained behavior that has long since governed inanimate objects. We are liberated from the limited behavioral repertoire of rocks and bottles of water to have this broad spectrum of responses. Do we pick them? We do not. Do we freely choose them? We do not. But yet we have them, and we can marvel at those behaviors, and that's the freedom that we have.
The complexity and the breadth of that repertoire is where the freedom. Yeah. Speaking of intentional action, and if prediction is indeed a core component of the brain, let me ask you a question that scientists also hate, is about free will. So how does do you think about free will much? How does that fit into your view of the brain? Why does it feel like we make decisions in this world?
This is a hard. Scientists hate this because it's a hard question. We don't know the answer to.
Have you taken a side?
I think
Do
I
we
have
free will.
I think I have taken a side, but I don't put a lot of stock in my own intuitions or anybody's intuitions about the cause of things. Right? One thing we know about the brain for sure is that the brain creates experiences for us. My brain creates experiences for me. Your brain creates experiences for you in a way that lures you to believe that those experiences actually reveals the way that it works, right. But it doesn't. So
you don't trust your own intuition about
really
free will.
Not really. No, I mean, no, but I am also somewhat persuaded by, I think Dan Dennett wrote at one point, the philosopher Dan Dennett wrote at one point that I can't say it as eloquently as him, but people obviously have free will. They are obviously making choices. So it's, and so there is this observation that we're not robots and we can do some things like a little more sophisticated than an amphioxus. So here's what I would say. I would say that your predictions, your internal model that's running right now, right? That your ability to understand the sounds that I'm making and attach them to ideas is based on the fact that you have years of experience knowing what these sounds mean in a particular statistical pattern, right? I mean, that's how you can understand the words that are coming out of my
Mouth.
right. I think we did this once before too, didn't we? When we were,
I don't know. I would have to access my memory module.
I think when I was in your,
The class thing?
yeah, I think we did it just like that actually. So bravo.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have to go look back to the tape.
Yeah. Anyways, the idea though is that your brain is using past experience, and it can use past experience in so it's remembering, but you're not consciously remembering. It's basically re-implementing prior experiences as a way of predicting what's going to happen next. Yeah. And it can do something called conceptual combination, which is it can take bits and pieces of the past and combine it in new ways. So you can experience and make sense of things that you've never encountered before because you've encountered something similar to them. Mm-hmm. And so a brain, in a sense, is not doesn't just contain information. It is information gaining, meaning it can create new information by this generative process. So in a sense, you could say, well, that maybe that's a source of free will. But I think really where free will comes from, or the kind of free will that I think is worth having a conversation about, is involves cultivating experiences for yourself that change your internal model. When you were born and you were raised in a particular context, that your brain wired itself to your surroundings, to your physical surroundings and also to your social surroundings. So you were handed an internal model, basically. But when you grow up, the more control you have over where you are and what you do, you can cultivate new experiences for yourself. And those new experiences can change your internal model. And you can actually practice those experiences in a way that makes them automatic, meaning it makes it easier for your brain to make them again. And I think that is something like what you would call free will. You aren't responsible for the model that you were handed, that someone, your caregivers cultivated a model in your brain. You're not responsible for that model, but you are responsible for the one you have now. You choose what you expose yourself to. You choose how you spend your time. Not everybody has choice over everything,
right,
but everybody has a little bit of choice. And so I think that is something that I think is arguably called free will.
Yeah, there's this, like the ripple effects of the billions of decisions you make early on in life are so great that even if it's like all deterministic, just the amount of possibilities that are created and then the focusing of those possibilities into a single trajectory, that somewhere within that's free will. Even if it's all deterministic, that might as well be just the number of choices that are possible, and the fact that you just make one trajectory through those set of choices seems to be like something like that would be called free will. But it's still kind of sad to think like there doesn't seem to be a place where there's magic in there, where it is all just a computer.
Well, there's lots of magic, I would say, so far, because we don't really understand how all of this is exactly played out at scientists are working hard and disagree about some of the details under the hood of what I just described, but I think there's quite a bit of magic, actually. And also there's also stochastic firing of neurons. They're not purely digital in the sense that there's also analog communication between neurons, not just digital. So it's not just with firing of axons. And some of that, there are other ways to communicate. And also, there's noise in the system, and the noise is there for a really good reason. And that is, the more variability there is, the more potential there is for your brain to be able to be information bearing. So basically, there are some animals that have clusters of cells. The only job is to inject noise, into their neural patterns.
So maybe noise is the source of free will.
So you can think about stochasticity or noise as a source of free will, or you can think of conceptual combination as a source of free will. You can certainly think about cultivating. You can't reach back into your past and change your past. People try by psychotherapy and so on, but what you can do is change your present, which becomes your past.
Well, let me
right.
think about that sentence.
So one way to think about it is that you're continuously, this is a colleague of mine, a friend of mine said, so what you're saying is that people are continually cultivating their past. And I was like, that's very poetic. Yeah. Yes. You are continually cultivating your past as a means of controlling your future.
So you think, I guess the construction of the mental model that you use for prediction ultimately contains within it your perception of the past, like the way you interpret the past, or even just the entirety of your narrative about the past. So you're constantly rewriting the story of your past. Oh boy. Yeah. That's one, poetic and also just awe-inspiring. Wow. Did you ever, again, just to stay on philosophical for a brief moment, do you ever think about free will and whether that exists? Because ultimately, free will sort of is this experience that we have, like we're making choices, even though it appears that, the world is deterministic at the core. I mean, that's against the debate, but if it is in fact deterministic at the lowest possible level, at the physics level, how do you make, if it is deterministic, how do you make sense of the difference between the experience of us feeling like we're making a choice and the whole thing being deterministic?
So first of all, let me give you a gut reaction to the question. And the gut reaction is that it is important that we believe that there exists free will. And second of all, almost by weird logic, if we believe it exists, then it does exist, okay?
Yeah.
So it's very important for our social apparatus, for our sense of ourselves, that it exists. And the moment in which, we so want it, we conjure it up in existence. But again, I really feel that if you look at some point, the space of free will seems to shrink. We realize how more and more, how much of our, say, genetic apparatus dictates who we are, why we prefer certain things than others, right? And why we react to noises of music. We prefer poetry or everything else. We may explain even all this. But at the end of the day, whether exist in a philosophical sense or not is like randomness. If pseudo-random is as good as random, vis-a-vis lifetime of the universe, our experience, then does it really matter?
Yeah. You mentioned the elephant and the monkey riding the elephant, and consciousness is the monkey, and there's some prodding that the monkey gets to do, and sometimes the elephant listens. I heard you got into some contention, maybe you can correct me, but I heard you got into some contentious free will discussions. Is this with Sam Harris or something like that?
Not that I know of.
Some people on Clubhouse told me you made a bunch of big debate points about free will. Well, let me just then ask you, where in terms of the monkey and the elephant, do you think we land in terms of the illusion of free will? How much control does the monkey have?
We have to think about what the free will is in the first place. We are not the machine. We are not this thing that is making the decisions. We are a model of that decision-making process.
Yeah.
And there is a difference between making your own decisions and predicting your own decisions.
Yes.
And that difference is the first-person perspective. And what basically makes decision-making under conditions of free will distinct from just automatically doing the best thing is that we often don't know what the best thing is. We make decisions under uncertainty. We make informed bets using a betting algorithm that we don't yet understand because we haven't reverse engineered our own mind sufficiently. We don't know the expected rewards. We don't know the mechanism by which we estimate the rewards and so on.
But there is an algorithm.
We observe ourselves performing, where we see that we weigh facts and factors and the future, and then some kind of possibility, some motive gets raised to an intention. And that's informed bet that the system is making. And that making of the informed bet, the representation of that is what we call free will. And it seems to be paradoxical because we think that's the crucial thing is about it, that it's somehow indeterministic. And yet, if it was indeterministic, it would be random. And it cannot be random because if it was random, if just dice were being thrown and the universe randomly forces you to do things, it would be meaningless. So the important part of the decisions is always the deterministic stuff. But it appears to be indeterministic to you because it's unpredictable. Because if it was predictable, you wouldn't experience it as a free will decision.
Right.
You would experience it as just doing the necessary right thing. And you see this continuum between the free will and the execution of automatic behavior when you are observing other people. So, for instance, when you are observing your own children. If you don't understand them, you will use this agent model where you have an agent with a set point generator, and the agent is doing the best it can to minimize the difference to the set point, and it might be confused and sometimes impulsive or whatever, but it's acting on its own free will. And when you understand what happens in the mind of the child, you see that it's automatic. And you can outmodel the child, you can build things around the child that will lead the child to making exactly the decision that you are predicting. And under these circumstances, like when you are a stage musician or somebody who is dealing with people that you sell a car to, and you completely understand the psychology and the impulses and the space of thoughts that this individual can have at that moment. Under these circumstances, it makes no sense to attribute free will. Because it's no longer decision-making under uncertainty. You are already certain. For them, there's uncertainty, but you already know what they're doing.
But what about for you? So is this akin to like systems like cellular automata where it's deterministic, but when you squint your eyes a little bit, it starts to look like there's agents making decisions at the higher sort of, when you zoom out and look at the entities that are composed by the individual cells, even though there's underlying simple rules that make the system evolve in deterministic ways, it looks like there's organisms making decisions. Is that where the illusion of free will emerges? That jump in scale?
It's a particular type of model, but this jump in scale is crucial. The jump in scale happens whenever you have too many parts to count and you cannot make a model at that level, right, and you try to find some higher level regularity. And the higher level regularity is a pattern that you project into the world to make sense of it. And agency is one of these patterns, right? You have all these cells that interact with each other, and the cells in our body are set up in such a way that they benefit if their behavior is coherent, which means that they act as if they were serving a common goal.
Right.
And which that means that they will evolve regulation mechanisms that act as if they were serving a common goal. And now you can make sense of all these cells by projecting the common goal into them.
Right. So for you, then, free will is an illusion.
No, it's a model and it's a construct. It's basically a model that the system is making of its own behavior. And it's the best model that it can come up with under the circumstances. And it can get replaced by a different model, which is automatic behavior, when you fully understand the mechanism under which you are acting.
Yeah, but another word for model is what? Story. So it's the story you're telling. I mean, do you actually have control? Is there such a thing as a you? And is there such a thing as you having control? So, like, are you manifesting your evolution as an entity?
In some sense, the you is the model of the system that is in control. It's a story that the system tells itself about somebody who is in control.
Yeah.
And the contents of that model are being used to inform the behavior of the system.
Okay.
So the
But
system is
why don't you
completely mechanical, and the system creates that story like a loom, and then it uses the contents of that story to inform its actions and writes the results of that actions into the story.
So how's that not an illusion? The story is written then. Or rather, we're not the writers of the story.
Yes, but we always knew that.
No, we don't know that. When did we know that?
I think that's mostly a confusion about concepts. The conceptual illusion in our culture comes from the idea that we live in physical reality and that we experience physical reality and that we have ideas about it.
Yep.
And then you have this dualist interpretation where you have two substances, res extensa, the world that you can touch and that is made of extended things, and res cogitans, which is the world of ideas. And in fact, both of them are mental representations. One is the representations of the world as a game engine that your mind generates to make sense of the perceptual data. And
That's
the other
physical
one,
world?
yes, that's what we perceive as the physical world. But we already know that the physical world is nothing like that, right? Quantum mechanics is very different from what you and me perceive as the world. The world that you and me perceive is a game engine.
Yeah.
And there are no colors and sounds in the physical world. They only exist in the game engine generated by your brain. And then you have ideas that cannot be mapped onto extended regions, right? So the objects that have a spatial extension in the game engine are res extensa, and the objects that don't have a physical extension in the game engine are ideas. And they both interact in our mind to produce models of the world.
Yep, but when you play video games, I understand that what's actually happening is zeros and ones inside of a computer, inside of a CPU and a GPU, but you're still seeing the rendering of that, and you're still making decisions whether to shoot, to turn left, or to turn right if you're playing a shooter. Or every time I start thinking about Skyrim and Elder Scrolls and walking around in beautiful nature and swinging a sword, but it feels like you're making decisions inside that video game. So even though you don't have direct access in terms of perception to the bits, to the zeros and ones, it still feels like you're making decisions, and your decisions are actually feels like they're being applied all the way down to the zeros and ones.
Yes.
So it feels like you have control, even though you don't have direct access to reality.
So there is basically a special character in the video game that is being created by the video game engine.
Yeah.
And this character is serving the aesthetics of the video game. And that is you.
Yes, but I feel like I have control inside the video game. Like all those 12-year-olds that kick my ass on the internet.
So when you play the video game, it doesn't really matter that there's zeros and ones, right? You don't care about the width of the bus. You don't care about the nature of the CPU that it runs on. What you care about are the properties of the game that you're playing. And you hope that the CPU is good enough.
Yes.
And a similar thing happens when we interact with physics. The world that you and me are in is not the physical world. The world that you and me are in is a dream world.
How close is it to the real world, though?
We know that it's not very close, but we know that the dynamics of the dream world match the dynamics of the physical world to a certain degree of resolution. But the causal structure of the dream world is different. So you see, for instance, waves crashing on your feet, right? But there are no waves in the ocean. There's only water molecules that have tangents between the molecules that are the result of electrons in the molecules interacting with each other.
But aren't they very consistent? We're just seeing a very crude approximation. Isn't our dream world very consistent, to the point of being mapped directly one-to-one to the actual physical world, as opposed to us being completely tricked? This is where you have Donald
it's not a trick. That's my point. It's not an illusion. It's a form of data compression.
Yeah.
It's an attempt to deal with the dynamics of too many parts to count at the level at which you're entangled with the best model that you can find.
Yeah, so we can act in that dream world, and our actions have impact in the real world, in the physical world.
Yes.
To which we don't have access.
Yes, but it's basically accepting the fact that the software that we live in, the dream that we live in, is generated by something outside of this world that you and me are in.
So is the software deterministic, and do we not have any control? Do we have so free will is having a conscious being. Free will is the monkey being able to steer the elephant.
No, it's slightly different. Basically, in the same way as you are modeling the water molecules in the ocean that engulf your feet when you are walking on the beach as waves, and there are no waves, but only the atoms and more complicated stuff underneath the atoms and so on. And you know that, right? You would accept, yes, there is a certain abstraction that happens here. It's a simplification of what happens, and a simplification that is designed in such a way that your brain can deal with it temporally and spatially in terms of resources, and tuned for the predictive value. So you can predict with some accuracy whether your feet are going to get wet or not.
But it's a really good interface and approximation.
Yes,
it's like E equals MC squared is a good equations are a good approximation for what they're much better approximation. So to me, waves is a really nice approximation of what's all the complexity that's happening underneath.
Basically, it's a machine learning model that is constantly tuned to minimize surprises. So it basically tries to predict as well as it can what you're going to perceive next.
Are we talking about which is the machine learning, our perception system or the dream world?
The machine world is dream world is the result of the machine learning process of the perceptual system.
That's doing the compression.
Yes. And the model of you as an agent is not a different type of model, or it's a different type, but not different as in its model-like nature from the model of the ocean, right? Some things are oceans, some things are agents. And one of these agents is using your own control model, the output of your model, the things that you perceive yourself as doing. Mm-hmm. And that is you.
What about the fact that it's like when you're standing and with the water on your feet and you're looking out into the vast, like open water of the ocean, and then there's a beautiful sunset, and the fact that it's beautiful, and then maybe you have like friends or a loved one with you, and like you feel love. What is that? As the dream world, or what is that?
Yes, it's all happening inside of the dream.
Okay, but see, the word dream makes it seem like it's not real.
Yeah, of course, it's not real. The physical universe is real, but the physical universe is incomprehensible and it doesn't have any feeling of realness. The feeling of realness that you experience gets attached to certain representations where your brain assesses this is the best model of reality that I have.
So the only thing that's real to you is the thing that's happening at the very base of reality, like
for something to be real, it needs to be implemented. So the model that you have of reality is real in as far as it is a model, right? It's an appropriate description of the world to say that there are models that are being experienced. Mm-hmm. But the world that you experience is not necessarily implemented.
So free will,
yes.
You believe at this current time that you have free will.
I believe my whole life I have free will. What a delusion. Not just kidding. I still believe it.
You still believe it. So at the same time, you think that in your conception of the universe, causality seems to be pretty fundamental.
That's right.
Which kind of wants the universe to be deterministic. So how the heck
because I'm
do you think you have a free will and yet you value causality?
Because I depart from the conception of physics that you can write down an initial condition and a fixed law of motion, and that will describe everything. There's no incompatibility if you are willing to reject that assertion.
So where's the randomness? Where's the magic that gives birth to the free will? Is it the randomness of the laws of physics?
No. In my mind, what free will is the fact that I, as a physical system, have causal control over certain things. I don't have causal control over everything, but I have a certain set of things. And I'm also, as I described, sort of a nexus of a particular set of histories that exist in the universe and a particular set of futures that might exist. And those futures that might exist are in part specified by my physical configuration as me. And therefore, it may not be free will in the traditional sense. I don't even know what people mean when they're talking about free will, honestly. It's like the whole discussion's really muddled. But in the sense that I am a causal agent, if you want to call it that exists in the universe, and there are certain things that happen because I exist as me, then yes, I have free will.
No, but do you Sarah have a choice about what's going to happen next?
Oh, I see.
Like if the universe, if I run this?
Yes, I think so.
You have a choice. Where's the choice come from? Is it?
I think that's related to the physics of consciousness. So one of the things I didn't say about that, I don't know, maybe this is me just being hopeful, because maybe I just want to have free will, but I don't think that we can rule out the possibility because I don't think that we understand enough about any of these problems. But I think one of the things that's interesting for me about the sort of inversion of the question of consciousness that I proposed is one of the features that we do is we have imagination, right? And people don't think about imagination as a physical thing, but it is a physical thing. Mm-hmm. It exists in the universe, right? And so I'm like really intrigued by the fact that, say, humans for, another physical system could do this too. It's not special to humans, but, for centuries imagined flying machines and rockets. And then we finally built them, right? So they were represented in our minds and on the pages of things that we drew for hundreds of years before we could build those physical objects in the universe. But certainly the existence of rockets is in part causally, caused by the fact that we could imagine them. And so there seems to be this property that some things don't exist. They've never physically existed in the universe, but we can imagine the possibility of them existing and then cause them to exist, maybe individually or collectively. And I think that property is related to what I would say about having choice or free will, because that set of possibilities, those set of things that you can imagine is not constrained to your local physical environment and history. And this is what's a little bit different about intelligence as we see it in humans and AI that we want to build than biological intelligence, because biological intelligence is predicated completely on the history of things it's seen in the past. But something happened with the neural architectures that evolved in multicellular organisms that they don't just have access to the past history of their particular, set of events, but they can imagine things that haven't happened, aren't on their timeline, and as long as they're consistent with laws of physics, make them happen.
So this is fascinating.
It's trippy physics, but it exists, so there you go.
I mean, in some sense, if you look at like general relativity and gravity morphing space-time, in that same way, maybe whatever the physics of consciousness might be, it might be morphing. That's like what free will is. It's morphing like the space, just like ideas make rockets come to life. It's somehow changing the space of possible realizations of like whatever's. Yeah, okay. But
life is kind of basically, if you want to think about it, like life is sort of changing the probability distributions over what can exist. That's the physics of what life is. And then consciousness is this sort of layered property or imagination on top of it that kind of scrambles that a little bit more and like has, access to, I don't know. It's kind of, we don't know how to describe it, right? Like that's why it's interesting. But
it's probabilistic, so you do think like God plays dice. So let me.
No, I think the description's probabilistic. I don't necessarily think the underlying physics is probabilistic. I think the way that we can describe this physics is going to be probabilistic and statistical, but like when we take measurements in the lab, but the underlying physics itself might still be deterministic. I don't know. Maybe it's hard to know what concepts to hold on to. So I find myself constantly rejecting concepts, but then I have to grab another one and try to hold on to something from intellectual history. Well,
it's possible that our mind is not able to hold the correct concepts in mind at all. Like we're not able to even conceive of them correctly. Maybe the words deterministic or random are not the right concepts to be holding. But maybe you can talk to the theory of everything, this attempt in the current set of physical laws to try to unify them. Is there any hope that once a theory of everything is developed, and by theory of everything I mean in a narrow sense of unifying quantum field theory and general relativity, do you think that will contain some, like in order to do that unification, you would have to get something that would then give hints about the physics of life, physics of existence, physics of consciousness? Yeah,
I used to not, but I actually, I have become increasingly convinced that it probably will. And part of the reason is, I think I've talked a little bit already about these holes in physics, like the theories we have in physics. They have problems. They have lots of problems, and they're very deep problems, and we don't know how to patch them. And some of those problems become very evident when you try to patch quantum mechanics and general relativity together. So there is this kind of interesting feature that some of the ways of patching that might actually closely resemble the physics of life. And so the place where that actually comes up most, and actually we just had a workshop in the Beyond Center where I work at Arizona State University, and Lee Smolin made this point that he thinks that the theory of quantum gravity, when we solve it, is going to be the same theory that gives rise to life. And I think that I agree with him on some levels, because there's something very interesting where if you look at these sort of causal set theories of gravity, where they're looking for space as being emergent, and so space-time is an emergent concept from a causal set, which is also sort of related, I think, to what Wolfram's doing with his physics project. It's the same kind of underlying math that we have in this theory that we've been developing related to life called assembly theory, which is, basically trying to look at complex objects like molecules and bacteria and living things as as basically being assembled from a set of component parts, and that they actually encode all the possible histories that they could have in that physical object. So mathematically, all these ideas, I think, are related. I think a lot of people are thinking about this from different perspectives. And then constructor theory that David Deutsch and Chiara Marletto have been developing is a totally different angle on it, but I think getting at some similar ideas. So it's a really interesting time right now, I think, for the frontiers of physics and how it's relating to maybe deeper principles about what life is. So short answer, yes. Long-winded answer, rewind.
So is there a free will?
This is a great
I apologize
question.
for the absurd high level philosophical questions.
No, these are my favorite kind of questions. Here's the thing. We don't know. If you ask most neuroscientists, they'll say that we can't really think of how you would get free will in there, because as far as we can tell, it's a machine. It's a very complicated machine, enormously sophisticated, 86 billion neurons, about the same number of glial cells. Each of these things is as complicated as the city of San Francisco. Each neuron in your head has the entire human genome in it. It's expressing millions of gene products. These are incredibly complicated biochemical cascades. Each one is connected to 10,000 of its neighbors, which means you have, like half a quadrillion connections in the brain. So it's this incredibly complicated thing, but it is fundamentally appears to just be a machine. And therefore, if there's nothing in it that's not being driven by something else, then it seems it's hard to understand where free will would come from. So that's the camp that pretty much all of us fall into. But I will say our science is still quite young. And, I'm a fan of the history of science. And the thing that always strikes me as interesting is when you look back at any moment in science, everybody believes something is true. And they simply didn't know about, what Einstein revealed or whatever. And so who knows?
They all feel like that at any moment in history, they all feel like we've converged to the final answer.
Exactly. Like all the pieces of the puzzle are there. And I think that's a funny illusion that's worth getting rid of. And in fact, this is what drives good science, is recognizing that we don't have most of the puzzle pieces. So as far as the free will question goes, I don't know. At the moment, it seems, wow, it'd be really impossible to figure out how something else could fit in there. But, 100 years from now, our textbooks might be very different than they are now.
I mean, could I ask you to speculate, where do you think free will could be squeezed into there? Like, what's that even? Is it possible that our brain just creates kinds of illusions that are useful for us? Or like where could it possibly be squeezed in?
Well, let me give a speculation answer to your very nice question, but don't, and the listeners to this podcast, don't quote me on this. Yeah, exactly. I'm not saying this is what I believe to be true, but let me just give an example. I give this at the end of my book, Incognito. So the whole book of Incognito is about, all what's happening in the brain. And essentially I'm saying, look, here's all the reasons to think that free will probably does not exist. But at the very end, I say, look, imagine that you are, imagine that you're a Kalahari bushman and you find a radio in the sand and you've never seen anything like this. And you look at this radio and you realize that when you turn this knob, you hear voices coming from it. There are voices coming from it. So being a radio materialist, you try to figure out, like, how does this thing operate? So you take off the back cover and you realize there's all these wires. And when you take out some wires, the voices get garbled or stop or whatever. And so what you end up developing is a whole theory about how this connection, this pattern of wires, gives rise to voices. But it would never strike you that in distant cities, there's a radio tower and there's invisible stuff beaming. And that's actually the origin of the voices. And this is just necessary for it.
Yeah.
So I mentioned this just as a speculation. Say, look, how would we know? What we know about the brain for absolutely certain is that when you damage pieces and parts of it, things get jumbled up. But how would you know if there's something else going on that we can't see, like electromagnetic radiation, that is what's actually generating this?
Yeah. You paint a beautiful example of how totally, because we don't know most of how our universe works, how totally off base we might be with our science.
Yeah.
That's inspiring. That's beautiful. It's kind of terrifying. It's humbling. It's all of the above.
And the important part, just to recognize, is that of course we're in the position of having massive unknowns, and we have, of course, the known unknowns, and that's all the things we're pursuing in our labs and trying to figure out that. But there's this whole space of unknown unknowns, things we haven't even realized we haven't.
In other cases, like one that I like to think about or like to point out as an example is free will and determinism. It's much less of a theorem and more a kind of way of thinking about things that I think is reassuring and avoids a lot of unnecessary quarreling and confusion.
The quarreling I'm okay with, and the confusion I'm okay with. I mean, people debate about difficult ideas, but the question is whether it could be almost a fundamental truth.
I think it is a fundamental truth.
Free will is both an illusion and not.
Yes, I think that's correct.
And there's a reason why people say quantum mechanics is weird, and complementarity is a big part of that. To say that our actual whole world is weird, the whole hierarchy of the universe is weird in this kind of particular way, and it's quite profound, but it's also humbling. Because it's like we're never going to be on sturdy ground in the way that humans like to be. It's like you have to embrace that. This whole thing is unsteady mess.
It's one of many lessons in humility that we run into in profound understanding of the world. I mean, the Copernican revolution was one that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Darwinian evolution is another, that humans are not the pinnacle of God's creation. The apparent result of deep understanding of physical reality, that mind emerges from matter, and there's no call on special life forces or souls. These are all lessons in humility, and I actually find complementarity a liberating concept. It's okay,
it is in a way.
Is what I remember. There's a story about Dr. Johnson, and he's talking with Boswell, and Boswell they were discussing a sermon that they both heard, and the sort of culmination of the sermon was the speaker saying, "I accept the universe." And Dr. Johnson said, "Well, he damn well better." and there's a certain joy in accepting the universe because it's mind expanding, and and to me, complementarity also suggests tolerance, suggests opportunities for understanding understanding things in different ways that add to rather than detract from understanding. So I think it's an opportunity for mind expansion, and demanding that there's only one way to think about things can be very limiting.
On the free will one, that's a trippy one, though. To think like I am the decider of my own actions, and at the same time I'm not, is tricky to think about. But there does seem to be some kind of profound truth in that.
I think it is tied up. It will turn out to be tied up when we understand things better with these issues of self-awareness and
think so.
And where we get what we perceive as making choices. What does that really mean, and what's going on under the hood? But I'm speculating about a future understanding that's not in place at present.
Your sense there will always be like as you dig into the self-awareness thing, there'll always be some places where complementarity is going to show up.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, there will be, how should I say? There'll be kind of a God's eye view, which sees everything that's going on in the computer or the brain. And then there's the brain's own view, or the central processor, or whatever it is. That's what we call the self, the consciousness, that's only aware of a very small part of it. And those are very different. Those are so the God's eye view can be deterministic, while the self view sees free will. Wow. I'm pretty sure that's how it's going to work out, actually. But as it stands, free will is a concept that we definitely, at least I feel I definitely experience. I can choose to do one thing than another, and other people I think are sufficiently similar to me that I trust that they feel the same way. And it's an essential concept in psychology and law and so forth. But at the same time, I think that mind emerges from matter, and that there's an alternative description of matter that's up to subtleties about quantum mechanics, which I don't think are relevant here, really is deterministic.
Is there free will? Are we able to make decisions that are not predetermined from the initial conditions of the universe?
Philosophers do this annoying thing of saying it depends what you mean. So in this case, it really depends on what you mean by free will. If you mean something which was not determined in advance, could never have been determined, then I don't know, we have free will. I mean, there's quantum mechanics, and who's to say if that opens up some room, but I'm not sure we have free will in that sense. But I'm also not sure that's the kind of free will that really matters. Mm-hmm. What matters to us is being able to do what we want and to create our own futures. We've got this distinction between having our lives be under our control and under someone else's control. We've got the sense of actions that we are responsible for versus ones that we're not. I think you can make those distinctions even in a deterministic universe. And this is what people call the compatibilist view of free will, where it's compatible with determinism. So I think for many purposes, the kind of free will that matters is something we can have in a deterministic universe. And I can't see any reason in principle why an AI system couldn't have free will of that kind. If you mean super duper free will, the ability to violate the laws of physics and doing things that in principle could not be predicted, I don't know, maybe no one has that kind of free will.
What's the connection between the reality of free will and the experience of it, the subjective experience, in your view? So how does consciousness connect to this, to the experience of, to the reality and the experience of free will?
It's certainly true that when we make decisions and when we choose and so on, we feel like we have an open future.
Yes.
Feel like, I could do this, I could go into philosophy, or I could go into math. I could go to a movie tonight. I could go to a restaurant. So we experience these things as if the future is open. I mean, maybe we experience ourselves as exerting a kind of effect on the future that's somehow picking out one path from many paths that were previously open. And you might think that actually if we're in a deterministic universe, there's a sense in which objectively those paths weren't really open all along. But subjectively, they were open. And I think that's what really matters in making a decision. So our experience of making a decision is choosing a path for ourselves. I mean, in general, our introspective models of the mind, I think, are generally very distorted representations of the mind. So it may well be that our experience of ourselves in making a decision, our experience of what's going on, doesn't terribly well mirror what's going on. I mean, maybe there are antecedents in the brain way before anything came into consciousness, and so on. Those aren't represented in our introspective models. So, in general, our experience of perception, it's like I experience a perceptual image of the external world. It's not a terribly good model of what's actually going on in my visual cortex and so on, which has all these layers and so on. It's just one little snapshot of one bit of that. So, in general, introspective models are very oversimplified, and it wouldn't be surprising if that was true of free will as well. This also, incidentally, can be applied to consciousness itself. There is this very interesting view that consciousness itself is an introspective illusion. In fact, we're not conscious, but the brain just has these introspective models of itself where it oversimplifies everything and represents itself as having these special properties of consciousness. It's a really simple way to kind of keep track of itself and so on. And then on the illusionist view, that's just an illusion. It was. I find this view, when I find it implausible, I do find it very attractive in some ways, because it's easy to tell some story about how the brain would create introspective models of its own consciousness, of its own free will, as a way of simplifying itself. I mean, it's a similar way when we perceive the external world, we perceive it as having these colors that maybe it doesn't really have, because that's a really useful way of keeping track.
Did you say that you find it not very plausible? Because I find it both plausible and attractive in some sense, because that kind of view is one that has the minimum amount of mystery around it. You can kind of understand that kind of view. Everything else says we don't understand so much of this picture.
Yeah. No, it is very.
What about free will?
Free will is also a nice exercise. Free will is an illusion that we AI people are going to solve.
So what do you think, once we solve it, that solution will look like? Once we put it in the page?
It will look like, first of all, it will look like a machine that acts as though it has free will. It communicates with other machines as though they have free will, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a machine that does and a machine that doesn't have free will. Okay?
So it propagates the illusion of free will amongst the other machines.
And faking it is having it. Okay, that's what Turing test is all about.
Yeah.
Faking intelligence is intelligent because it's not easy to fake. It's very hard to fake, and you can only fake if you have it.
Yeah.
So
that's such a beautiful statement. You can't fake it if you don't have it. Yeah.
There's a cause to everything. That's personally what I believe. I don't believe that I have like free will. I think I have the illusion of free will, but I believe there's a cause for everything. And if I'm doing something because of a cause, by definition, there's no free will in a way. If there's a cause, by definition, there's not.
How does that make you feel, by the way? Like the idea that if we just look outside of even just human psychology and fighting and so on, if we look at like physics, if everything is predetermined, if all of these little molecules interacting, it's all already, like your story is already written.
I mean, it depends. It's written, but I would need to know all the data, and it's impossible, right? It's kind of weird, I gotta say, but I don't see any argument to counter that idea. Maybe I'm ignorant, but I haven't seen nobody, and everything that I've read so far, there's nothing that countered that idea that because in a mechanical world, if your car broke, or we don't say, the car decided to broke, or a trees fall, there's reason why the tree is falling. We don't say the trees decide to fall, right? So because us human being, I think it's our ego. We decide, and I'm no different than anybody. When I make a decision, I decided to do this. I choose to do this. But I'm aware that there is causes that make me do certain things. And by definition, I think if there is a cause, there is no free will. By definition, right?
Yes, but the thing is, just like you said, we understand so little about human intelligence, the human mind, and especially consciousness, that this giant mystery, this darkness that we don't understand, how it feels like to be something, to be a conscious being, that because of that, we're not able to really even reason about free will or not. Because there might be some magic that comes from consciousness. The consciousness might be the thing that makes us different from a car that breaks down. There might be something totally fascinating, totally undiscovered yet, that will make us realize that free will is actually real and is somehow fundamental to the human experience. So it's sometimes, I think, we forget when we talk about free will and physics and it all seeming to be predetermined, we forget how little we actually understand about the world. And I think in that mystery, there could be totally new ideas that are yet to be discovered and will make us realize that it's not just an illusion. It is something that is like at the core of how the universe works. Some people believe that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe. Like it's one of the forces of physics. Like consciousness permeates everything. It's in everything. Like this table is conscious, but it's not as conscious as us. And we're this little peak of consciousness. And if that's true, and if we get to understand that, maybe there's an extra bonus we get in terms of free will once you become one of those entities that are super conscious. So I tend to be sort of humbled by the mystery of it. Turns out you were right. I'm going to ask you about free will.
Oh, okay.
You've recently released an episode of your podcast, Making Sense, for those with a shorter attention span, basically summarizing your position on free will. I think it was under an hour and a half.
Yeah.
It was brief and clear. So allow me to summarize the summary, TLDR, and maybe you tell me where I'm wrong. So free will is an illusion, and even the experience of free will is an illusion. Like we don't even experience it. Where am I good in my summary?
Yeah, I mean, this is a line that's a little hard to scan for people. I say that it's not merely that free will is an illusion. The illusion of free will is an illusion, right? Like there is no illusion of free will. And that is unlike many other illusions, that's a more fundamental claim. It's like, it's not that it's wrong. It's not even wrong. I mean, that's, I guess that was, I think Wolfgang Pauli, who derided one of his colleagues or enemies with that aspersion about his theory in quantum mechanics. So there are things that there are genuine illusions. There are things that you do experience, and then you can kind of punch through that experience, or you can't actually experience. You can't experience them any other way. It's just we just know it's not a veridical experience. You just take like a visual illusion. There are visual illusions that, a lot of these come to me on Twitter these days. There's these amazing visual illusions where, like, every figure in this GIF seems to be moving, but nothing in fact is moving. You can just like put a ruler on your screen and nothing's moving. Some of those illusions you can't see any other way. I mean, they're hacking aspects of the visual system that are just eminently hackable, and you have to use a ruler to convince yourself that the thing isn't actually moving. Now, there are other visual illusions where you're taken in by it at first, but if you pay more attention, you can actually see that it's not there, right? Or it's not how it first seemed. Like the Necker cube is a good example of that. Like the Necker cube is just that schematic of a cube, of a transparent cube, which pops out one way or the other. One face can pop out and the other face can pop out. But you can actually just see it as flat with no pop out, which is a more veridical way of looking at it. So there are kind of inward correlates to this, and I would say that the sense of self and free will are closely related. I mean, I often describe them as two sides of the same coin, but they're not quite the same in their spuriousness. I mean, so the sense of self is something that people, I think, do experience, right? It's not a very clear experience, but it's not, I wouldn't call the illusion of self an illusion, but the illusion of free will is an illusion in that as you pay more attention to your experience, you begin to see that it's totally compatible with an absence of free will. You don't, I mean, coming back to the place we started, you don't know what you're going to think next. You don't know what you're going to intend next. You don't know what's going to just occur to you that you must do next. You don't know how much you're going to feel the behavioral imperative to act on that thought. If you suddenly feel, oh, I don't need to do that. I can do that tomorrow. You don't know where that comes from. You didn't know that was going to arise. You didn't know that was going to be compelling. All of this is compatible with some evil genius in the next room just typing in code into your experience. Just like this, okay, let's give him the, oh my God, I just forgot it was going to be our anniversary in 1 week thought, right? Give him the cascade of fear. Give him this brilliant idea for the thing he can buy that's going to take him no time at all, and this overpowering sense of relief. All of our experience is compatible with the script already being written, right? And I'm not saying the script is written. I'm not saying that fatalism is the right way to look at this, but we just don't have even our most deliberate voluntary action where we go back and forth between two options, thinking about the reason for A and then reconsidering and going thinking harder about B, and just going eeny, meeny, miny, mo until the end of the hour. However laborious you can make it, there is a utter mystery at your back, finally promoting the thought or intention or rationale that is most compelling and therefore deliberate, behaviorally effective, and just this can drive some people a little crazy. So I usually preface what I say about free will with the caveat that if thinking about your mind this way makes you feel terrible, well then stop. Get off the ride. Switch the channel. You don't have to go down this path. But for me and for many other people, it's incredibly freeing to recognize this about the mind, because one you realize that cutting through the illusion of the self is immensely freeing for a lot of reasons that we can talk about separately. But losing the sense of free will does two things very vividly for me. One is it totally undercuts the psychological basis for hatred, right? Because when you think about the experience of hating other people, what that is anchored to is a feeling that they really are the true authors of their actions. I mean, that someone is doing something that you find so despicable, right? Let's say they're targeting you unfairly, right? They're maligning you on Twitter, or they're suing you, or they're doing something. They broke your car window. They did something awful, and now you have a grievance against them, and you're relating to them very differently emotionally in your own mind than you would if a force of nature had done this, right? Or if it had just been a virus, or if it had been a wild animal, or a malfunctioning machine, right? Like, to those things you don't attribute any kind of freedom of will. And while you may suffer the consequences of catching a virus or being attacked by a wild animal or having your car break down or whatever, it may frustrate you. You don't slip into this mode of hating the agent in a way that completely commandeers your mind and deranges your life. I mean, you just don't. I mean, there are people who spend decades hating other people for what they did, and it's just pure poison.
So it's a useful shortcut to compassion and empathy.
Yeah, yeah.
But the question is, say that this called what was it? The horse of consciousness. Let's call it the consciousness generator black box that we don't understand. And is it possible that the script that we're walking along, that we're playing, that's already written, is actually being written in real time? It's almost like you're driving down a road, and in real time, that road is being laid down.
Yeah.
And this black box of consciousness that we don't understand is the place where this script is being generated. So it is being generated. It didn't always exist. So there's something we don't understand that's fundamental about the nature of reality that generates both consciousness. Let's call it maybe the self. I don't know if you want to distinguish between those.
Yeah, I definitely would. Yeah.
You would. Because there's a bunch of illusions we're referring to. There's the illusion of free will. There's the illusion of self. And there's the illusion of consciousness. You're saying, I think you said you're not as willing to say there's an illusion of consciousness. You're a little bit more.
In fact, I would say it's impossible.
Impossible.
Yeah.
You're a little bit more willing to say that there's an illusion of self. And you're definitely saying there's an illusion of free will.
Yes. I'm definitely saying there's an illusion that a certain kind of self is an illusion. Not every. We mean many different things by this notion of self. So maybe I should just differentiate these things. So consciousness can't be an illusion because any illusion proves its reality as much as any other veridical perception. I mean, if you're hallucinating now, that's just as much of a demonstration of consciousness as really seeing what's, quote, actually there. If you're dreaming and you don't know it, that is consciousness, right? You can be confused about literally everything. You can't be confused about the underlying claim, whether you make it linguistically or not, but just the cognitive assertion that something seems to be happening. It's the seeming that is the cash value of consciousness.
Can I take a tiny tangent?
Okay.
So what if I am creating consciousness in my mind to convince you that I'm human? So it's a useful social tool, not a fundamental property of experience, like of being a living thing. What if it's just like a social tool to almost like a useful computational trick to place myself into reality as we together communicate about this reality? And another way to ask that, because you said it much earlier, you talked negatively about robots, as you often do. So let me, because you'll probably die first when they take over.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to certain kinds of robots. I mean, I'm not. If we can get this right, this would be amazing.
Right. But you don't like the robots that fake consciousness. That's what you don't like the idea of fake it till you make it.
Well, no, it's not that I don't like it. It's that I'm worried that we will lose sight of the problem, and the problem has massive ethical consequences. I mean, if we create robots that really can suffer, that would be a bad thing, right? And if we really are committing a murder when we recycle them, that would be a bad thing.
This is how I know you're not Russian. Why is it a bad thing that we create robots that can suffer? Isn't suffering a fundamental thing from which like beauty springs? Like without suffering, do you really think we would have beautiful things in this world? Like,
that's a tangent on a tangent.
We'll
we'll go there. I would love to go there, but let's not go there just yet.
All right.
But I do think it would be, if anything is bad, creating hell and populating it with real minds that really can suffer in that hell. That's bad. That's hell. That's you are worse than any mass murderer we can name if you created. I mean, this could be in robot form, or more likely it would be in some simulation of a world where we managed to populate it with conscious minds, so that whether we knew they were conscious or not, and that world is a state of that's it's unendurable. That would just taking the thesis seriously that there's nothing that mind, intelligence, and consciousness ultimately are substrate independent, right? You don't need a biological brain to be conscious. You certainly don't need a biological brain to be intelligent, right? So if we just imagine that consciousness at some point comes along for the ride as you scale up in intelligence, well, then we could find ourselves creating conscious minds that are miserable, right? And that's just like creating a person who's miserable, right? It could be worse than creating a person who's miserable. It could be even more sensitive to suffering.
Cloning them and maybe for entertainment, watching them suffer.
Just like watching a person suffer for entertainment, you know? So, but back to your primary question here, which is differentiating consciousness and self and free will as concepts and kind of degrees of illusoriness. The problem with free will is that what most people mean by it, and that and Dan, this is where Dan Dennett is going to get off the ride here, right? So like he's going to disagree with me that I know what most people mean by it, but I have a very keen sense, having talked about this topic for many, many years and seen people get wrapped around the axle of it, and seeing in myself what it's like to have felt that I was a self that had free will, and then to no longer feel that way, right? I mean, to know what it's like to actually disabuse myself of that sense, cognitively and emotionally, and to recognize what's left, what goes away, and what doesn't go away on the basis of that epiphany. I have a sense that I know what people think they have in hand when they worry about whether free will exists. And it is the flip side of this feeling of self. It's the flip side of feeling like you are not merely identical to experience. You feel like you're having an experience. You feel like you're an agent that is appropriating an experience. There's a protagonist in the movie of your life, and it is you. It's not just the movie, right? It's like there's sights and sounds and sensations and thoughts and emotions and this whole cacophony of experience, of felt experience of embodiment. But there seems to be a rider on the horse or a passenger in the body, right? People don't feel truly identical to their bodies down to their toes. They sort of feel like they have bodies. They feel like they're minds in bodies. And that feels like a self. That feels like me. And again, this gets very paradoxical when you talk about the experience of being in relationship to yourself or talking to yourself, giving yourself a pep talk. I mean, if you're the one talking, why are you also the one listening? Like, why do you need the pep talk, and why does it work if you're the one giving the pep talk, right?
Yeah.
Or if I say, like, where are my keys, right? If I'm looking for my keys, why do I think the superfluous thought, where are my keys? I know I'm looking for the fucking keys. I'm the one looking. Mm-hmm. Who am I telling that, that we now need to look for the keys, right? So that duality is weird, but leave that aside. There's the sense, and this becomes very vivid when people try to learn to meditate. Most people, they close their eyes and they're told to pay attention to an object like the breath, say. So you close your eyes and you pay attention to the breath, and you can feel it at the tip of your nose or the rising and falling of your abdomen. And you're paying attention and you feel something vague there. And then you think, why the breath? Why am I paying attention to the breath? What's so special about the breath? And then you notice you're thinking and you're not paying attention to the breath anymore. And then you realize, okay, the practice is, okay, I should notice thoughts and then I should come back to the breath. But this starting point is the conventional starting point of feeling like you are an agent, very likely in your head, a locus of consciousness, a locus of attention that can strategically pay attention to certain parts of experience. Like, I can focus on the breath, and then I get lost in thought, and now I can come back to the breath, and I can open my eyes, and I'm over here behind my face, looking out at a world that's other than me, and there's this kind of subject-object perception. And that is the default starting point of selfhood, of subjectivity. And married to that is the sense that I can decide what to do next, right? I am an agent who can pay attention to the cup. I can listen to sounds. There's certain things that I can't control. Certain things are happening to me and I just can't control them. So for instance, if someone asks, well, can you not hear a sound, right? Like don't hear the next sound, don't hear anything for a second, or don't hear, I'm snapping my fingers, don't hear this. Where's your free will? Well, like just stop this from coming in. You realize, okay, wait a minute. My abundant freedom does not extend to something as simple as just being able to pay attention to something else than this. Okay, well, so that I'm not that kind of free agent, but at least I can decide what I'm going to do next, and I'm going to pick up this water, right? And there's a feeling of identification with the impulse, with the intention, with the thought that occurs to you, with the feeling of speaking. Like, what am I going to say next? Well, I'm saying it, so here goes. This is me. It feels like I'm the thinker. I'm the one who's in control. But all of that is born of not really paying close attention to what it's like to be you. And so this is where meditation comes in, or this is where again you can get at this conceptually. You can unravel the notion of free will just by thinking certain thoughts, but you can't feel that it doesn't exist unless you can pay close attention to how thoughts and intentions arise. So the way to unravel it conceptually is just to realize, okay, I didn't make myself, I didn't make my genes, I didn't make my brain, I didn't make the environmental influences that impinged upon this system for the last 54 years that have produced my brain in precisely the state it's in right now, with all of the receptor weightings and densities, and it's just I'm exactly the machine I am right now through no fault of my own as the experiencing self. I get no credit and I get no blame for the genetics and the environmental influences here. And yet those are the only things that contrive to produce my next thought or impulse or moment of behavior. And if you were going to add something magical to that clockwork, like an immortal soul, you can also notice that you didn't produce your soul, right? Like you can't account for the fact that you don't have the soul of someone who doesn't like any of the things you like, or wasn't interested in any of the things you were interested in, or was a psychopath, or had an IQ of 40. I mean, there's nothing about that the person who believes in a soul can claim to have controlled. And yet that is also totally dispositive of whatever happens next.
But everything you've described now, maybe you can correct me, but it kind of speaks to the materialistic nature of the hardware.
But even if you add magical ectoplasm software, you didn't produce that either.
I know, but if we can think about the actual computation running on the hardware and running on the software. There's something you said recently, which you think of culture as an operating system. So if we just remove ourselves a little bit from the conception of human civilization being a collection of humans, and rather us just being a distributed computation system on which there's some kind of operating system running, and then the computation that's running is the actual thing that generates the interactions, the communications, and maybe even free will, the experiences of all those free will. Do you ever try to reframe the world in that way, where it's like ideas are just using us, thoughts are using individual nodes in the system, and they're just jumping around, and they also have ability to generate like experiences so that we can push those ideas along. And basically the main organisms here are the thoughts, not the humans.
Yeah, but then that erodes the boundary between self and world.
Right.
So then there's no self, a really integrated self to have any kind of will at all. Like if you're just a meme-plex, I mean, if there's just like, if you're just a collection of memes,
yeah.
And I mean, like we're all kind of like currents, like eddies in this river of ideas, right? So it's like, and it seems to have structure, but there's no real boundary between that part of the flow of water and the rest. I mean, and I would say that much of our mind answers to this kind of description. I mean, so much of our mind has been. It's obviously not self-generated, and you're not going to find it by looking in the brain. It is the result of culture largely, but also it's the genes on one side and culture on the other meeting to allow for manifestations of mind that aren't actually bounded by the person in any clear sense. It was the example I often use here, but there's so many others, is just the fact that we're following the rules of English grammar to whatever degree we are. It's not that we certainly haven't consciously represented these rules for ourselves. We haven't invented these rules. We haven't. I mean, there are norms of language use that we couldn't even specify because we're not grammarians. We haven't studied this. We don't even have the right concepts, and yet we're following these rules, and we're noticing as an error when we fail to follow these rules. And virtually every other cultural norm is like that. I mean, these are not things we've invented. You can consciously decide to scrutinize them and override them, but I mean, just think of any social situation where you're with other people and you're behaving in ways that are culturally appropriate, right? You're not being wild animals together. You're following. So you have some expectation of how you shake a person's hand and how you deal with implements on a table, how you have a meal together. Obviously, this can change from culture to culture, and people can be shocked by how different those things are, right? We all have foods we find disgusting, but in some countries, dog is not one of those foods, right? And yet, you and I presumably would be horrified to be served dog. Those are not norms that they are outside of us in some way, and they're felt very viscerally. I mean, they're certainly felt in their violation. If you are, just imagine you're in somebody's home, you're eating something that tastes great to you, and you happen to be in Vietnam or wherever you didn't realize dog was potentially on the menu, and you find out that you've just eaten 10 bites of what is really a Cocker Spaniel, and you feel this instantaneous urge to vomit, right, based on an idea, right? You're not the author of that norm that gave you such a powerful experience of its violation. And I'm sure we can trace the moment in your history, vaguely where it sort of got in. I mean, very early on as kids, you realize you're treating dogs as pets and not as food or as potential food. But yeah, no, but the point you just made opens us to, we are totally permeable to a sea of mind.
Yeah, but if we take the metaphor of the distributed computing systems, each individual node is part of performing a much larger computation, but it nevertheless is in charge of doing the scheduling of, assuming it's Linux, is doing the scheduling of processes and is constantly alternating them. That node is making those choices. That node sure as hell believes it has free will, and actually has free will because it's making those hard choices, but the choices ultimately are part of a much larger computation that it can't control. Isn't it possible for that node to still be, that human node is still making the choice?
Well, yeah, it is. So I'm not saying that your body isn't really doing things, right? And some of those things can be conventionally thought of as choices, right? So it's like I can choose to reach, and it's not being imposed on me. That would be a different experience. So there's an experience of there's definitely a difference between voluntary and involuntary action. That has to get conserved by any account of the mind that jettisons free will. You still have to admit that there's a difference between a tremor that I can't control and a purposeful motor action that I can control and that I can initiate on demand, and it's associated with intentions and it's got efferent, motor copy, which is being predictive, so that I can notice errors. I have expectations when I reach for this. If my hand were actually to pass through the bottle because it's a hologram, I would be surprised, right? And so that shows that I have a expectation of just what my grasping behavior is going to be like even before it happens. Whereas with a tremor, you don't have the same kind of thing going on. That's a distinction we have to make. So I'm really my intention to move, which is in fact can be subjectively felt, really is the proximate cause of my moving. It's not coming from elsewhere in the universe. I'm not saying that. So in that sense, the node is really deciding to execute, the subroutine now. But that's not the feeling that has given rise to this conundrum of free will, right? So the people feel like the crucial thing is that people feel like they could have done otherwise, right? That's the thing that so when you run back the clock of your life, right? You run back the movie of your life, you flip back the few pages in the novel of your life. They feel that at this point they could behave differently than they did, right? So but given even given your distributed computing example, it's either a fully deterministic system, or it's a deterministic system that admits of some random influence. In either case, that's not the free will people think they have. The free will people think they have is, damn, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have done that. I could have done otherwise, right? I should have done otherwise, right? Like if you think about something that you deeply regret doing, right, or that you hold someone else responsible for, because they really are the upstream agent in your mind of what they did. That's an awful thing that person did, and they shouldn't have done it. There is this illusion, and it has to be an illusion, because there's no picture of causation that would make sense of it. There's this illusion that if you arrange the universe exactly the way it was a moment ago, it could have played out differently. And the only way it could have played out differently is if there's randomness added to that. But randomness isn't what people feel would give them free will, right? If you tell me that, I only reached for the water bottle this time because there's a random number generator in there kicking off values, and it finally moved my hand. Mm-hmm. That's not the feeling of authorship.
That's still not control. You're still not making that decision. No. There's actually, I don't know if you're familiar with cellular automata. It's a really nice visualization of how simple rules can create incredible complexity, that it's like really dumb initial conditions are set, simple rules applied, and eventually you watch this thing, and if the initial conditions are correct, then you're going to have emerge something that to our perception system looks like organisms interacting. You can construct any kinds of worlds, and they're not actually interacting. They're not actually even organisms, and they certainly aren't making decisions. So there's like systems you can create that illustrate this point. The question is whether there could be some room for, let's use in the 21st century the term magic, back to the black box of consciousness. Let me ask you it this way. If you're wrong about your intuition about free will, and somebody comes along to you and proves to you that you didn't have the full picture, what would that proof look like? What would
well, that's the problem. That's why it's not even an illusion in my world, because for me it's impossible to say what the universe would have to be like for free will to be a thing, right? It's just it doesn't conceptually map onto any notion of causation we have, and that's unlike any other spurious claim you might make. So, like, if you're gonna believe in ghosts, right? I understand what that claim could be, right? Like, I don't happen to believe in ghosts, but if it's not hard for me to specify what would have to be true for ghosts to be real. And so it is with 1,000 other things like ghosts, right? So, like, Okay, so you're telling me that when people die, there's some part of them that is not reducible at all to their biology that lifts off them and goes elsewhere, and is actually the kind of thing that can linger in closets and in cupboards and actually it's immaterial, but by some principle of physics we don't totally understand, it can make sounds and knock, objects, and even occasionally show up so they can be visually beheld. And it seems like a miracle, but this is just some spooky noun in the universe that we don't understand. Let's call it a ghost. That's fine. I can talk about that all day. The reasons to believe in it, the reasons not to believe in it, the way we would scientifically test for it, what would have to be provable so as to convince me that ghosts are real. Free will isn't like that at all. There's no description of any concatenation of causes that precedes my conscious experience that sounds like what people think they have when they think they could have done otherwise, and that the conscious agent is really in charge, right? Like if you don't know what you're going to think next, right, and you can't help but think it, take those two premises on board. You don't know what it's going to be. You can't stop it from coming. And until you actually know how to meditate, you can't stop yourself from fully living out its behavioral or emotional consequences, right? Like mindfulness, arguably gives you another degree of freedom here. It doesn't give you free will, but it gives you some other game to play with respect to the emotional and behavioral imperatives of thoughts. But short of that, I mean, the reason why mindfulness doesn't give you free will is because you can't account for why in one moment mindfulness arises, right, and in other moments it doesn't, right? But a different process is initiated once you can practice in that way.
Well, if I could push back for a second. By the way, I just have this thought bubble popping up all the time of just two recent chimps arguing about the nature of consciousness. It's kind of hilarious. Mm-hmm. So on that thread,
right,
if we're even before Einstein, let's say before Einstein, we were to conceive about traveling from point A to point B, say some point in the future, we are able to realize through engineering a way which is is consistent with Einstein's theory that you can have wormholes. You can travel from one point to another faster than the speed of light. And that would, I think, completely change our conception of what it means to travel in the physical space. And that, completely transform our ability. You talk about causality, but here let's just focus on what it means to travel through physical space. Don't you think it's possible that there will be inventions or leaps in understanding about reality that will allow us to see free will as actually, us humans somehow maybe linked to this idea of consciousness are actually able to be authors of our actions?
It's a non-starter for me conceptually. It's a little bit like saying, could there be some breakthrough that will cause us to realize that circles are really square, or that circles are not really round, right? No, a circle is what we mean by a perfectly round form, right? Like it's not on the table to be revised. And so I would say the same thing about consciousness. It's just like saying, is there some breakthrough that would get us to realize that consciousness is really an illusion? I'm saying no, because what the experience of an illusion is as much a demonstration of what I'm calling consciousness as anything else, right? Like that is consciousness. With free will, it's a similar problem. It's like, again, it comes down to a picture of causality, and there's no other picture on offer. And what's more, I know what it's like on the experiential side to lose the thing to which it is clearly anchored, right? Like it doesn't feel. I mean, this is the question that almost nobody asks. People who are debating me on the topic of free will, I'm 50 15-minute intervals, I'm making a claim that I don't feel this thing, and they are never become interested in, well, what's that like? Like, okay, so you're actually saying you don't, this thing isn't, isn't true for you empirically. It's not just because most people who don't believe in free will philosophically also believe that we're condemned to experience it. Like you can't live without this feeling. So
you're actually saying you're able to experience the absence of the illusion of free will.
Yes.
Are we talking about
whenever
a few minutes at a time, or is this require a lot of work and meditation, or are you literally able to load that into your mind and like play that movie?
right now, just in this conversation? So it's not absolutely continuous, but it's whenever I pay attention. It's like it's the same, and I would say the same thing for the illusoriness of the self in the sense. And again, we haven't talked about this. So
can you still have the self and not have the free will in your mind at the same time? Do they go at the same time?
This is the same. Yeah, it's the same thing that.
So they're always holding hands when they walk out the door.
I mean, there really are two sides of the same coin.
Okay,
but it's just it comes down to what it's like to try to get to the end of this sentence, or what it's like to finally decide that it's been long enough and now I need another sip of water. Right? If I'm paying attention now, if I'm not paying attention, I'm probably I'm captured by some other thought, and that feels a certain way, right? And so it's not vivid. But if I try to make vivid this experience of just, okay, I'm finally going to experience free will. I'm going to notice my free will, right? Like if it's got to be here. Everyone's talking about it. Where is it? I'm going to pay attention to it. I'm going to look for it, and I'm going to create a circumstance that is where it has to be most robust, right? I'm not rushed to make this decision. It's not a reflex. I'm not under pressure. I'm going to take as long as I want. I'm going to decide. It's not trivial. So it's not just like reaching with my left hand or reaching with my right hand. People don't like those examples for some reason. Let's make a big decision. Like, what should my next podcast be on, right? Who do I invite on the next podcast? What is it like to make that decision? When I pay attention, there is no evidence of free will anywhere in sight. It's like it doesn't feel like it feels profoundly mysterious to be going back between two people. Is it going to be person A or person B? I've got all my reasons for A and all my reasons why not, and all my reasons for B, and that there's some math going on there that I'm not even privy to, where certain concerns are trumping others. And at a certain point, I just decide. And yes, you can say I'm the node in the network that has made that decision. Absolutely. I'm not saying it's being piped to me from elsewhere. But the feeling of what it's like to make that decision is totally without a real sense of agency. Because something simply emerges. It's literally as tenuous as what's the next sound I'm going to hear, right? Or what's the next thought that's going to appear, and something just appears, And if something appears to cancel that something, like if I say I'm going to invite her, and then I'm about to send the email, and then I think, oh no, I can't do that. There was that thing in that New Yorker article I read that I got to talk to this guy, right? That pivot at the last second, you can make it as muscular as you want. It always just comes out of the darkness. It's always mysterious.
So right, when you try to pin it down, you really can't ever find that free will. If you construct an experiment for yourself and you're trying to really find that moment when you're actually making that controlled author decision,
and we know at this point that if we were scanning your brain in some podcast guest choosing experiment, right? We know at this point we would be privy to who you're going to pick before you are. You, the conscious agent. If we could, again, this is operationally a little hard to conduct, but there's enough data now to know that something very much like this cartoon is in fact true, and will ultimately be undeniable for people. They'll be able to do it on themselves with their, some app. If you're deciding what to, where to go for dinner, or who to have on your podcast, or ultimately, who to marry, right? Or what city to move to, right? Like you can make it as big or as small a decision as you want. We could be scanning your brain in real time, and at a point where you still think you're uncommitted, we would be able to say with arbitrary accuracy, all right, he's moving to Austin, right?
I didn't choose that.
Yeah, it was going to be Austin, or it was going to be Miami. He's catching one of these two waves, but it's going to be Austin. And at a point where you subjectively, if we could ask you, you would say, "Oh no, I'm still working over here. I'm still thinking. I'm still considering my options."
And you've spoken to this in you thinking about other stuff in the world. It's been very useful to step away from this illusion of free will, and you argue that it's probably makes a better world because you can be compassionate and empathetic towards others
and toward oneself. Radically toward others, in that literally hate makes no sense anymore. I mean, there's certain things you can really be worried about, really want to oppose. Really, I mean, I'm not saying you'd never have to kill another person. Like, I mean, self-defense is still a thing, right? But the idea that you're ever confronting anything other than a force of nature in the end goes out the window, right? Or does go out the window when you really pay attention. I'm not saying that this would be easy to grok if someone kills a member of your family. I'm not saying you can just listen to my 90 minutes on free will and then you should be able to see that person as identical to a grizzly bear or a virus. Because we are so evolved to deal with one another as fellow primates and as agents. But it's, when you're talking about the possibility of, Christian, truly Christian forgiveness, right? It's that as testified to by, various, saints of that flavor over the millennia. Yeah, the doorway to that is to recognize that no one really at bottom made themselves, right? And therefore everyone, what we're seeing really are differences in luck in the world. We're seeing people who are very, very lucky to have had good parents and good genes and to be in good societies and had good opportunities and to be intelligent and to be, not sociopathic. Like, none of it is on them. They're just reaping the fruits of one lottery after another, and then showing up in the world on that basis. And then so it is with, every malevolent asshole out there, right? He or she didn't make themselves. Even if that weren't possible, the utility for self-compassion is also enormous, because it's when you just look at what it's like to regret something or to feel shame about something or feel deep embarrassment about it. These states of mind are some of the most deranging experiences anyone has, and their the indelible reaction to them. The memory of the thing you said, the memory of the wedding toast you gave 20 years ago that was just mortifying, right? The fact that can still make you hate yourself, right? And like that psychologically, that is a knot that can be untied, right?
Speak for yourself, Sam.
Yeah.
So clearly
you
you're not.
You gave a great toast. It was my toast that mortified.
No, that's not what I was referring to. I'm deeply appreciative in the same way that you're referring to of every moment I'm alive, but I'm also powered by self-hate often. Like several things in this conversation already that I've spoken, I'll be thinking about, like, that was the dumbest thing. You're sitting in front of Sam Harris and you said that. So like that, but that somehow creates a richer experience for me. Like I've actually come to accept that as a nice feature of however my brain was built. I don't think I want to let go of that.
Well, I think the thing you want to let go of is the suffering associated with it. So for me, it's just very psychologically and ethically, all of this is very interesting. So I don't think we should ever get rid of things like anger, right? So like hatred is divorceable from anger, in the sense that hatred is this enduring state where, whether you're hating somebody else or hating yourself, it is toxic and durable and ultimately useless, right? Like it becomes self nullifying, right? You become less capable as a person to solve any of your problems. It's not instrumental in solving the problem that is occasioning all this hatred. And anger, for the most part, isn't either, except as a signal of salience that there's a problem, right? So if somebody does something that makes me angry, that just promotes this situation to conscious attention in a way that is stronger than my not really caring about it, right? And there are things that I think should make us angry in the world, and there's the behavior of other people that should make us angry, because we should respond to it. And so it is with yourself. If I do something, as a parent, if I do something stupid that harms one of my daughters, right? My experience of myself and my beliefs about free will close the door to my saying, well, I should have done otherwise, in the sense that if I could go back in time, I would have actually effectively done otherwise. No, I would given the same causes and conditions, I would do that thing a trillion times in a row, right? But, regret and feeling bad about an outcome are still important to capacities, because I desperately want my daughters to be happy and healthy. So if I've done something, if I crash the car when they're in the car and they get injured, right? And I do it because I was trying to change a song on my playlist, or something stupid, I'm going to feel like a total asshole. How long do I stew in that feeling of regret, right? And what utility is there to extract out of this error signal? And then what do I do? We're always faced with the question of what to do next, right? And how to best do that thing, that necessary thing next. And how much well-being can we experience while doing it? Like how miserable do you need to be to solve your problems in life, and to help solve the problems of people closest to you? How miserable do you need to be to get through your to-do list today? Ultimately, I think you can be deeply happy going through all of it, right? And even navigating moments that are scary and, really destabilizing to ordinary people. And I think, again, I'm always up kind of at the edge of my own capacities here, and there are all kinds of things that stress me out and worry me. And especially something, if you're going to tell me it's something with, the health of one of my kids, it's very hard for me, to be truly equanimous around that. But equanimity is so useful the moment you're in response mode, right? Because it's the ordinary experience for me of responding to what seems like a medical emergency for one of my kids is to be obviously super energized by concern to respond to that emergency. But then once I'm responding, all of my fear and agitation and worry and, oh my God, what if this is really something terrible? But finding any of those thoughts compelling, that only diminishes my capacity as a father to be good company while we navigate this really turbulent passage,
As you're saying this, actually, one guy comes to mind, which is Elon Musk. One of the really impressive things to me was to observe how many dramatic things he has to deal with throughout the day at work, but also if you look through his life, family too, and how he's very much actually, as you're describing, basically a practitioner of this way of thought, which is you're not in control. You're basically responding, no matter how traumatic the event, and there's no reason to sort of linger on the
Well, yeah, they
not
couldn't
the
be.
negative feelings around that.
Well, so I mean, he's in a very specific situation, which is unlike normal life. You know, even his normal life, but normal life for most people, because when you just think of, like, you know, he's running so many businesses, and they're highly non-standard businesses. So what he's seeing is everything that gets to him is some kind of emergency. Like, it wouldn't be getting to him if it needs his attention.
Right.
There's a fire somewhere. So he's constantly responding to fires that have to be put out. So there's no default expectation that there shouldn't be a fire, right? But in our normal lives, we live, most of us who are lucky, right? Not everyone, obviously, on Earth, but most of us who are at some kind of cruising altitude in terms of our lives, where we're reasonably healthy and life is reasonably orderly and the political apparatus around us is reasonably functionable. So I said functionable for the first time in my life through no free will of my own. So, like, I noticed those errors, and they do not feel like agency, and nor does the success of an utterance feel like agency. When you're looking at normal human life, right, where you're just trying to be happy and healthy and get your work done, there's this default expectation that there shouldn't be fires. People shouldn't be getting sick or injured. You know, we shouldn't be losing vast amounts of our resources. We should, so when something really stark like that happens, people don't have that muscle that they're like. I've been responding to emergencies all day long, you know, 7 days a week in business mode, and so I have a very thick skin. This is just another one. I'm not expecting anything else when I wake up in the morning. No, we have this default sense that, I mean, honestly, most of us have the default sense that we aren't going to die, right? Or that we should, like, maybe we're not going to die, right? Like death denial really is a thing. You know, we're because, and you can see it, just like I can see when I reach for this bottle that I was expecting it to be solid, because when it isn't solid, when it's a hologram and my fist closes on itself, I'm damn surprised. People are damn surprised to find out that they're going to die, to find out that they're sick, to find out that someone they love has died or is going to die. So it's like the fact that we are surprised by any of that shows us that we're living we're living in a mode that is, you know, we're perpetually diverting ourselves from some facts that should be obvious, right? And the more salient we can make them, you know, the more. I mean, in the case of death, it's a matter of being able to get one's priorities straight. I mean, the moment, again, this is hard for everybody, even those who are really in the business of paying attention to it. But the moment you realize that every circumstance is finite, right? You've got a certain number of, you know, you've got whatever it is, 8,000 days left in a normal span of life, and 8,000 sounds like a big number. It's not that big a number, right? So it's just like, and then you can decide how you want to go through life, and how you want to experience each one of those days. And so I was back to where our jumping off point. I would argue that you don't want to feel self-hatred ever. I would argue that you don't want to really grasp on to any of those moments where you are internalizing the fact that you just made an error, you embarrassed yourself, that something didn't go the way you wanted it to. I think you want to treat all of those moments very, very lightly. You want to extract the actionable information. It's something to learn. Oh, you know, I learned that when I prepare in a certain way, it works better than when I prepare in some other way or don't prepare, right? Yes, lesson learned, you know, and do that differently. But yeah, I mean, so many of us have spent so much time with a very dysfunctional and hostile and even hateful inner voice governing a lot of our self-talk and a lot of just our default way of being with ourselves. I mean, the privacy of our own minds. We're in the company of a real jerk a lot of the time, and that can't help but affect. I mean, forget about just your own sense of well-being. It can't help but limit what you're capable of in the world with other people.
I'll have to really think about that. I just take pride that my jerk, my inner voice jerk, is much less of a jerk than like somebody like David Goggins, who's like screaming in his ear constantly. So I have a relativist kind of perspective that it's not as bad as that, at least.
Well, having a sense of humor also helps. You know, it's just like it's not the stakes are never quite what you think they are, and even when they are, I mean, it's just the difference between being able to see the comedy of it rather than because again, there's this sort of dark star of self-absorption that pulls everything into it, right? And it's like if that's the algorithm you don't want to run. So it's like you just want things to be good. So like just push the concern out there, like not have the collapse of, oh my God, what does this say about me? It's just like what does this say about how do we make this meal that we're all having together as fun and as useful as possible?
And you're saying in terms of propulsion systems, you recommend humor as a good spaceship to escape the gravitational field of that darkness.
Well, that certainly helps. Yeah.
So if you look at the trend and the speed with which human genetics has progressed, we can now find thousands of genes involved in human cognition, in human psychology, in the emotions and the feelings that we used to think are uniquely learned. Turns out there's a genetic basis to a lot of that. So the human genome has continued to elucidate through these studies of genetic variation so many different processes that we previously thought were, something that like free will. Free will is this beautiful concept that humans have had for a long time. In the end, it's just a bunch of chemical reactions happening in your brain, and the particular abundance of receptors that you have this day based on what you ate yesterday, or that you have been wired with based on, your parents and your upbringing, etc., determines a lot of that quote unquote free will component to, sort of narrower and narrower scale, slices.
So how much, on that point, how much freedom do you think we have to escape the constraints of our genome? You're making it sound like more and more we're discovering that our genome has a lot of the story already encoded into it. How much freedom do we have?
Do you think? So let me describe what that freedom would look like. That freedom would be my saying, "Ooh, I'm going to resist the urge to eat that apple because I choose not to." But there are chemical receptors that made me not resist the urge to prove my individuality and my free will by resisting the apple. So then the next question is, well, maybe now I'll resist the urge to resist the apple and I'll go for the chocolate instead to prove my individuality. But then what about those other receptors that,
that might be all encoded in there.
So it's kicking the bucket down the road and basically saying, well, your choice may have actually been driven by other things that you actually are not choosing. So that's why it's very hard to answer that question.
Well, it's hard to know what to do with that. I mean, if the genome has, if there's not much freedom, it's
the butterfly effect. It's basically that in the short term, you can predict something extremely well by knowing the current state of the system. Mm-hmm. But a few steps down, it's very hard to predict based on the current knowledge. Is that because the system is truly free? When I look at weather patterns, I can predict the next 10 days. Is it because the weather has a lot of freedom and after 10 days, it chooses to do something else? Or is it because, in fact, the system is fully deterministic and there's just a slightly different magnetic field of the Earth, slightly more energy arriving from the sun, a slightly different spin of the gravitational pull of Jupiter that is now causing, all kinds of tides and slight deviation of the moon, etc. Maybe all of that can be fully modeled. Maybe the fact that China is emitting a little more carbon today is actually going to affect the weather in, Egypt in 3 weeks. And all of that could be fully modeled.
In the same way, if you take a complete view of a human being now, I model everything about you. The question is, can I predict your next step? Probably. But at how far? And if it's a little further, is that because of stochasticity and sort of chaos properties of unpredictability of beyond a certain level? Or was that actually true free will?
Yeah. So the number of variables might be so you might need to build an entire universe to be able
to simulate a human, and then maybe that human will be fully simulatable. But maybe aspects of free will exist. And where's that free will coming from? It's still coming from the same neurons, or maybe from a spirit inhabiting these neurons. But again, it's very difficult empirically to sort of evaluate where does free will begin, and sort of chemical reactions and electric signals and.
I think it'd be fun to ask you about some big philosophical questions to see if you have an opinion on them. Do you think there's a free will, or is free will just an illusion?
Well, I think classical mechanics would tell us that if we were to know every piece of information about a system and understand the rules which govern that system, we would be completely able to predict the future with complete accuracy. So if something could know everything about our lives, it could freeze time and understand the position of every neuron in my mind about to fire, no decision could be unpredictable. There, in some sense, there is that sort of fate. I think that doesn't make the decisions we make illegitimate, even if some grand supercomputer could understand what decisions we would make beforehand with complete certainty. I think we're making legitimate systems within a system that has no freedom.
We're making legitimate systems within a system that has no freedom. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. So if we were to have just a simple pendulum, and I told you how long the rope was, we froze it at a particular point, and I told you how high above the ground the weight was, and the motion of a pendulum is something which it's easy for everyone to imagine. I could, if we had all of that information, you could ask me, what will the pendulum do 6.5 minutes from now? And we would have a precise answer. That's an example of a very simple system with a very simple Lagrangian. And we could completely predict the future. The pendulum has no ability to do anything that would surprise us. Weirdly, that's true of whatever this four-dimensional crazy world we live in looks like. If we were to understand where every piece of this system was at any given time, and we understand the laws of motion, how everything worked, if we could compute all of that information somehow, which we will never be able to do, we would, every decision you will ever make could be predicted by that computer. That doesn't mean that your decisions are illegitimate. You are really making those decisions, but with a completely predictable outcome.
So I'm just sort of a little bit high at the moment on the poetry of a system within a system that has no freedom. So the human experience is the system we've created within the system that has no freedom, but that system that we've created has a feeling of freedom that to us ants feels as much more real than the physics as we understand it of the underlying base system. So it's almost like not important what the physics of the base system is. That for what we've created, the nature of the human experience is there is a free will.
Or there's something that feels close enough to a free will that it may not be worth spending too much time on the fact that it's something of an illusion. We will never build a computer that knows everything about every piece of the universe at a given time. And so for all intensive purposes, our decisions are up to us. We just happen to know that their outcomes could be predicted with enough information.
So, hey, by the way, I completely forgot because you were talking about the systems and decision trees and the illusion of choice. Made me think of Sam Harris, and I forgot to mention it. So he talks about free will quite a bit, and that there's an illusion of free will. So it's
a
like
bold claim, Cotton.
Is that maybe the universe constructed that little game where it makes us feel like we have a bunch of choices, but we really don't. We're really always ending up with a middle finger.
That would be hilarious.
Yeah, that's it. That's what you see before you die. It's just a giant middle finger. It's like, oh fuck!
I knew it. I knew it.
What do you think? Do you think there's a free will? Like we feel like we're making choices. So you're thinking, again, we're talking about. Okay, here's a system of martial arts that's Renzo Gracie. There's different schools and whatever. And then you're thinking, okay, how can I think outside these systems? But then there's also a system that's our human society, and we feel like there's an actual choice being made by us individuals. Do you think that choice is real, or is it just an illusion?
Well, okay, that's a really good question. I'm not necessarily equipped to answer this, but I'll do my best. Okay, I guess I would say to start with, sure would be interesting if it wasn't real, if the choice wasn't real. Would be pretty interesting if it is real. First off, I would start with facilitative beliefs versus not facilitative beliefs. It's almost like I think the world's out to get me. True, not true. What next? Mm-hmm. Probably not a facilitative belief. Even if imagine you believe there's no free will. Mm-hmm. Okay, now what? Does that justify every single impulse that you're going to give into? Or does the belief in free will, does the belief in my ability to work hard, to focus, to be disciplined, to improve my position, improve my situation, whether it's true or not, although I think that at least many of us would argue that at least whether there's some sort of internal driver that allows for that.
Yeah.
Like we live in a material world. Your actions do affect the world. I can choose to pick that water up or not. And anyway, I would say I believe strongly in the idea of picking facilitative beliefs, and going, hey, I will adjust whether this belief system is right or wrong on a cosmic level. I'm nowhere near smart enough to understand, but I can say me deciding that, let's say, for instance, I'm going to walk over to have a conversation with someone in a hotel lobby and I've never met them. And I go over and I start with, this is going to be interesting. And I just walk over there versus in my head, I'm like, what's this asshole want? We're about to have two very different conversations. I could be right that this person's not very polite or thinks negatively of me right from go, but I think that that's probably not a facilitative belief. People talk about, how is that going to help me navigate the conversation to a positive conclusion? And I think about that for, let's say fighting. It's a good example. Like confidence. Plenty of people believe plenty of things that aren't real, myself included, I'm sure, all the time. And anyway, believing that you can do something, I'm like, hey, I think I can win. Doesn't guarantee you a positive outcome, but I would say it most of us would probably, most of us would argue that it helps.
And you're
think
thinking
about depression.
believing.
What's depression if not a negative, unfacilitative belief that is not always, that oftentimes is not reflected by reality, but you project it onto reality. And it's understandable if it makes you feel like, oh man, this isn't going to work out. I don't think the prospects are going well. And then if you feel like you can't get out of that loop, that seems pretty rough. And I see a lot of things out in society right now where you go, whether you agree or disagree with various positions on things, you go, is that a facilitative belief? Even if that is true, which is arguable, anything. So what next, man? So where does this end? When is the positive? What's the happy ending here? And if they go, well, there is no happy ending, I'm like, okay, so now what? So what do we do here? And I guess so
choose the facilitative belief, and in your intuition, believing that free will is real is more productive for a successful life.
Absolutely, because otherwise, how am I? First off, how can society function if it's not real? So how can I blame you or anyone else or hold anyone responsible for anything if free will isn't real?
Well, no, that's exactly the point. But at the surface level, what you're saying is true. But perhaps if we truly internalize that free will is an illusion, we'll start to figure out something that that transforms the way we see society. For example, we are very individual centric. So believing that free will is real puts a lot of responsibility and blame on people when they do something bad. Maybe if we truly internalize that free will is an illusion, we start to think about the system of humans together as like this mechanism for progress, as opposed to where individual people are responsible for their actions, good or bad. So we like remove the value, the weight we assign to the accomplishments or the violence, the negative stuff done by individuals, and more look at the progress of society. I don't know what that looks like, but it's almost like, as opposed to focusing on the individual ants of an ant colony, looking at the entirety of the ant colony.
I think it makes perfect sense. I would just say that that's a reasonable thing to suggest. It's a seismic shift, right? And it's hard to say whether that would be, better or worse, but I guess I'll use this as a convenient one for me. So I remember the last time we spoke, I brought up, one of the most reviled evil characters in certainly recent history, probably human history period, Adolf Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm a big fan of making people live in the world that they want to believe in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if free will doesn't exist and it's just about how things move forward, when are we going to be high-fiving this guy or what? Like, this is, because I remember what I said, and, that actually brings me to something else we discussed.
For people who don't know, Ryan brought up, or I brought up, there's literally a giant book about Hitler so I've been obsessed with Hitler, World War II, and Stalin recently. Oh man, this has become like a meme. Joe Rogan with like DMT and me with Hitler. Can I pick something more positive, like Cat in the Hat or something? I don't know. But you brought up Hitler as an example of something particular, of some philosophical discussions we're having, and the excellent, eloquent, and the full of integrity MMA journalist clipped out something you've said about Hitler, and said that I forget what the headlines are, but there were the most ridiculous possible implementation.
Basically, nitwits intentionally misunderstanding what I'm saying. Then it's like, I get that they're stupid, but I'm stupid too, so I know what that's like. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I can't give you a pass on that. But basically, intentionally misunderstanding what's going on. But what I find funny is that, hey, we got to be careful what we believe. And again, back to the cancel culture thing that we discussed last time as well, where would I like to apologize? I mean, no, actually something about cancel culture that we've been seeing things culturally. I'm like, I will be damned if I apologize for anything that I don't need to apologize for, because I was intentionally misunderstood in that instance. Now, you could say that that I'm not a historical scholar, which I would agree immediately, and also that I oftentimes ineloquently or inarticulately phrase things, which I'll agree as again. But ultimately, going, hey, I want to make you live in the world that you're suggesting ought to exist. Okay, so if there's no free will, is everything how far of a step back are we willing to take cosmically before we start going, hey, this is good? Because we're experiencing a social, a reckoning in our country at the moment, for good and for other, probably, I guess. And basically, but hey, it all worked out, right? So that's probably not something that would fly. And I think that's a fair thing.
That's interesting. It might not fly from the individual perspective, but if you zoom out and think of, appreciate society as, just like an ant colony, as a beautifully complex system. Like, we kind of, from the individual perspective, we value progress, especially progress of the individual, but in whole progress of societies. But if you accept that this is just a complex system that's not necessarily headed anywhere, that this is almost like that river, it's just flowing, I think that removes the burden of always striving, of always trying, of always like the struggle and so on. So it's possible that if we have no control, you can like arrive at some kind of other Zen state.
Does that sound very human though?
That goes against, I think, our current human condition as we experience it, but we've communicated that to each other. Like, so we've taught, like, through these social forces, taught each other that our lives matter and so on. Maybe if we convince ourselves that we're just sort of like little things in a stream and ultimately none of it matters, there might be some kind of enjoyment to be discovered through that process. I'm a capitalist, rah, like.
But I guess I think you're bringing up a really important point. Like, I guess almost anything like capitalism, I only get to experience it as I sit here now, and I get to live. I was raised in the United States, have traveled around the world a little bit, have had the good fortune of meeting many people from many different places, and I'm an end user of capitalism. I don't really know how it got here, whether it was, I wasn't there at the start of this idea. I wasn't there for, hey, how did we come up with this idea? How did we arrive? And I'm nowhere near well read enough to understand any of that really, even secondhand. And I guess recognizing that communism, Marxism, socialism, anarchism, anything is, these are all perspectives that all have, I guess, various strengths and weaknesses. But I guess one thing I guess I would say the burden, it seems to me that if you want to make a change, the burden of proof is on the person, implying that there needs to be a change.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that there's nothing there, but it's like if you want to create a small shift, a ripple, that's fine, but a seismic ripping shift in how we exist or how we experience the world as human beings. And you mentioned fighting, why watching someone take abuse on a level in the ring that's just shocking and then triumph in spite of it is like you're like, this is unbelievable. This is part of the magic of combat sports. Now, it's part of the magic. The other side of the magic that doesn't get talked about sometimes is that the trajectory of that individual's life later on is not always great. Or there's a cost for that. But if we remember, you mentioned removing the struggle. I don't personally. The struggle is what makes life. Is what makes life. And also, I guess, something for us is brought up to me on a number of occasions is that and it makes sense to me. It's basically, humans only understand things, through relative comparison. I only understand, heat because I've known cold. I only understand, it's like talking to someone that's, never experienced any sort of hardship, and then their latte isn't right. And then they pitch a fit, versus someone that's gone through a great deal of challenge, struggle, in their life. They tend to have a little bit more of an even perspective. And anyway, and of course, even is a relative thing, and what I perceive to be even may not be even. Maybe I'm particularly soft or something in the other direction without realizing, because I can only understand what I can understand. But the idea that we want to fundamentally alter ourselves as a species and as people seems like an incredibly high bar to prove, and also like an incredibly dangerous idea. Because it always comes back to, well, who's going to be responsible for this? Who gets to do the choosing? What's a good idea? What's not a good idea? And I guess that actually brings me kind of to something I've been encountering recently in discussions with friends. I feel like there's only two types of people that I encounter at this point. People with a more or less libertarian tilt to their thinking, and people without it. And when I say libertarian, I don't mean that in the political party sense or even the belief system. Basically, where I'm like, hey, you do you, buddy. It's not what you're up to is not my concern, versus what you're up to is my concern. And I guess I've always watched, at various points in history, people on this side or people on that side are more or less, I guess problematic, I guess you could say. And I don't mean that in the internet sense. I mean, more of an issue. But the world is always full of people that want to tell you what you need to be doing, as opposed to more or less do no harm. And I guess that's one of the ones. Anytime I'm trying to tell other people what to do, I better hope I'm right. And it's bizarre to me how many people are so confident that their side or their position is the one that's not only right for them, but right enough that they can enforce it on others. And that just seems incredibly dangerous to me. And I guess that comes back to even Sam's point about, we want to, trying to spread the idea that free will doesn't exist. I'm not saying it's damaging, but it very well may be. And plenty of other things could be as well. I'm not, it goes way over my head as to, the implications of all of these. And I guess all of us are an evangelist for something. But I guess it's weird that we've gotten this far as a species, and now we want to take like sharp turns.
Well, we've been taking a bunch of sharp turns throughout history.
Yeah,
that's what that's the way. Okay, humans love power, and one way to attain power is to say everything that you guys are doing is wrong, and I have the right thing, and I'm going to build up a giant cult of people, and I'm going to overthrow. And indirectly, what that results in is me gaining power, and that's how you get all the big revolutions in human history. Saying I'm done with the thing that the powerful are currently doing. So I'm going to overthrow. That's where probably all the identity politics that's happening now is people that didn't have power before are looking to gain power. And they're also, that's where Jordan Peterson criticizes identity politics is people with the good intentions, I should say, are in seeking power, allow power to corrupt them, as power always does. And so they lose track of like the devils that they're fighting by becoming the same kind of devils, the same kind of evil that they're fighting. And so that's just the progress of human history. But hopefully, as these power greedy people keep attaining power with a progressive mindset, over time things get better and better as they continue, as they
like
have
each iteration.
Each iteration, a lot of unfairness happens, a lot of hypocrisy happens, a lot of people are trampled along the way by those who mean well. But over time, like lessons are learned, or like civilization accumulates lessons, and in part learns the lessons of history. And it gets better and better over time, even though in the short term, there's people acting not their best selves. And, that seems to be the progress of human history. The idea of internalizing with free will not being real, you're actually making me realize that ultimately leads to a kind of...
doesn't that go in a nihilistic direction?
Yeah, it's both nihilistic, or if you want to make it a political system, then it's more like communist type of a system where like the value of the individual is completely removed. Or another perspective is like the freedom of an individual is not to be valued or protected. And so from our current perspective, the systems that seem to have worked, the United States works pretty damn well, despite all the different criticisms. It seems like freedom of the individual in all its forms seems to be fundamental to the success of the United States. And so it's however the hell you put it, is like, doesn't matter whether free will is or isn't an illusion. The belief that it's real
protects the individual from the group, which is fundamentally, correct me if I'm wrong, that always seems like the big issue of history. Hey, there's more of me than there is of you. Deal with it. You're like, yikes.
Yeah.
And you want to be yourself. You want to be different. You want to have a different religion. You want to be a different skin color. You want to do this. All the bad tribal things happen when there's more of me than you. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's always the fundamental power imbalance, though, right?
Well, the interesting thing about the libertarian thinking, I guess I don't know. Those words are really...
Maybe they're all charged. I know what you mean.
Yeah, they're all charged.
I may not scale up, but I mean more like on a philosophical underpinning where you're like, yeah, basically, hey, you feel free to believe I'm a fool. And I'm plenty of people do, I'm sure. But as long as you don't chase me down the hall and hit me in the back of the head with a textbook, what's the big deal?
You've tweeted, quote, assembly theory explains why Nietzsche understood we had limited freedom rather than radical freedom. So we've applied assembly theory to cellular automata in life and chemistry. What does Nietzsche have to do with assembly theory?
Oh, that gets me into free will and everything.
So let me say that again. Assembly theory explains why Nietzsche understood we had limited freedom rather than radical freedom. Limited freedom, I suppose, is referring to the fact that there's constraints.
Yeah.
Or what is radical freedom? What is freedom?
So Sartre was like believed in absolute freedom, and that he could do whatever he wanted in his imagination. And Nietzsche understood that his freedom was somewhat more limited. And it kind of takes me back to this computer game that I played when I was 10. So I think it's called Dragon's Lair.
Okay.
Do you know Dragon's Lair?
I think I know Dragon's Lair, yeah.
Dragon's Lair, I knew I was being conned, right? Dragon's Lair, when you play the game, you're lucky that you grew up in a basically procedurally generated world.
That was RPG a little bit. No, it's like, is it turn-based play? Was it?
It was a role-playing game, but really good graphics, and one of the first laser discs. And when you actually flicked the stick, it was like a graphical adventure game with animation.
Yeah.
And when I played this game, I really, you could get through the game in 12 minutes if you knew what you were doing without making mistakes. You just play the disc, play the disc. So it was just about timing. And actually, it was a complete fraud because all the animation has been pre-recorded on the disc.
Yeah.
It's like the Black Mirror, the first interactive, where they had all the, several million permutations of the movie that you could select on Netflix. I've forgotten the name of it. So this was exactly that in the Laserdisc. So you basically go left, go right, fight the ogre, slay the dragon. And when you flick the joystick at the right time, it just goes to the next animation to play. Yeah. It's not really generating it. Yeah. And I played that game and I knew I was being had.
Okay. I see. So to you, Dragon Lair is the first time you realized that free will is an illusion.
Yeah.
And why does assembly theory give you hints about free will, whether it's an illusion or not?
Yeah, so not tightly. If I do think I have some will, and I think I am an agent, and I think I can interact, and I can play around with the model I have of the world and the cost functions, right? And I can hack my own cost functions, which means I have a little bit of free will. But as much as I want to do stuff in the universe, I don't think I could suddenly say, I mean, actually, this is ridiculous because now I say I could try and do it, right? It's like I'm going to suddenly give up everything and become a rapper tomorrow, right? Maybe I could try that, but I don't have sufficient agency to make that necessarily happen. I'm on a trajectory. So when in Dragon's Lair, I know that I have some trajectories that I can play with, where Sartre realized he thought that he had no assembly, no memory. He could just leap across and do everything. And Nietzsche said, okay, I realize I don't have full freedom, but I have some freedom. And the assembly theory basically says that. It says, if you have these constraints in your past, they limit what you are able to do in the future, but you can use them to do amazing things. Let's say I'm a poppy plant and I'm creating some opiates. The opiates are really interesting molecules. I mean, they're obviously great for medicine, cause great problems in society. But let's imagine we fast forward 1 billion years. What will the opioids look like in 1 billion years? Well, we can guess because we can see how those proteins will evolve and we can see how the secondary metabolites will change. But they can't go radical. They can't suddenly become, I don't know, like a molecule that you find in an OLED in a display. They will be limited by the causal chain that produced them. Right. And that's what I'm getting at, saying we are unpredictably predictable or predictably unpredictable within a constraint on the trajectory we're on.
Yeah, so the predictably part is the constraints of the trajectory, and the unpredictable part is the part that you still haven't really clarified of the origin of the little bit of freedom.
Yeah.
So you're just arguing, you're basically saying that the radical freedom is impossible. You're really operating in a world of constraints that are constrained by the memory of the trajectory of the chemistry that led to who you are. Okay. But, even just a tiny bit of freedom, even if everywhere you are in cages, if you can move around in that cage a little bit, you're free.
I agree.
And so the question is, in assembly theory, if we're thinking about free will, where does the little bit of freedom come from? What is the I that can decide to be a rapper? What is that? That's a cute little trick we've convinced each other of so we can do fun tricks at parties, or is there something fundamental that allows us to feel free, to be free?
I think that's the question that I want to answer. I know you want to answer it, and I think it's so profound. Let me have a go at it. I would say that I don't take the stance of Sam Harris, because I think Sam Harris, when he said the way he says it, it's really interesting. I'd love to talk to him about it. Sam Harris almost thinks himself out of existence, right? Because he said, I don't, because, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, he has different views on consciousness versus free will. I think he saves himself with consciousness. He thinks himself out of existence with free will.
Yeah, exactly. So that, then there's no point, right? So
he's a leaf floating on a river.
Yeah, I think that he's. I don't know. I'd love to ask him whether he really believes that, and then we could play some games.
Oh yeah.
No. I then would say I'll get him to play a game of cards with me, and I'll work out the conditions on which he says no, and then I'll get him in the conditions he says yes, and then I'll trap him in his logical inconsistency with that argument. Because at some point, when he loses enough money, or the prospect of losing enough money, there's a way of basically mapping out a series of. So what will is about let's not call it free will. What will is about is to have a series of decisions equally weighted in front of you. And those decisions aren't necessarily energy minimization. Those decisions are a function of the model you've made in your mind, in your simulation, and the way you've interacted in reality, and also other interactions that you're having with other individuals and happenstance. And I think that there's a little bit of delay in time. So I think what you're able to do is say, well, I'm going to do the counterfactual. I've done all of them, and I'm going to go this way. And you probably don't know why. I think free will is actually a very complex interaction between your unconscious, and your conscious brain. And I think the reason why we're arguing about it is so interesting, in that some people outsource their free will to their unconscious brain, and some people try and overthink the free will in the conscious brain. I would say that Sam Harris has realized his conscious brain doesn't have free will, but his unconscious brain does. That's my guess, right?
And that he can't have access to the unconscious brain.
Yeah, and that's kind of annoying. And
so he's going to, through meditation, come to acceptance with that fact.
Yeah, which is maybe okay. But I do think that I have the ability to make decisions, and I like my decisions. In fact, this is an argument I have with some people, that some days I feel I have no free will and it's just an illusion, and this is and it makes me more radical, if you like. That I get to explore more of the state space, and I'm like, I'm going to try and affect the world now. I'm really going to ask the question that maybe I dare not ask, or do the thing I dare not do, and that allows me to kind of explore more.
It's funny that if you truly accept that there's no free will, that is a kind of radical freedom. It's funny, but because the little bit of the illusion under that framework that you have, that you can make choices. If choice is just an illusion of psychology, you can do whatever the hell you want.
But we don't, do we? And I think,
but because you don't truly accept that, you think that there's a choice, which is why you don't just do whatever the hell you want. Like, you feel like there's some responsibility for making the wrong choice, which is why you don't do it. But if you truly accept that the choice has already been made, then you can go. I don't know what is the most radical thing. I wonder what am I preventing myself from doing that I would really want to do? Probably like humor stuff. Like, I would love to, if I could like save a game, do the thing, and then reload it later, like do undo. It'd probably be humor, just to do something like super hilarious. That's super embarrassing, and then just go. It's basically just fun. I would add more fun to the world.
I sometimes do that. As I sometimes I try and mess up my reality in unusual ways by just doing things because I'm bored, but not bored. I'm not expressing this very well. I think that this is a really interesting problem that perhaps the hard sciences don't really understand that they are responsible for, because the question about how life emerged and how intelligence emerges and consciousness and free will, they're all ultimately boiling down to some of the same mechanics, I think. My feeling is that they are the same problem again and again and again. Mm-hmm. The transition from a boring world, or a world in which there is no selection. So I wonder if free will has something to do with selection in the models, and also the models you're generating in the brain, and also the amount of memory, working memory, you have available at any one time to generate counterfactuals.
Oh, that's fascinating. So like the decision-making process is a kind of selection.
Yeah.
And that could be just
absolutely
yet another manifestation of the selection mechanism that's pervasive throughout the universe. Okay. That's fascinating to think about. Yeah, there's not some kind of fundamental its own thing or something like that. That is just yet another example of selection.
Yeah, and in a universe that's intrinsically open, you want to do that because you generate novels.
Let me ask: if we look at the deepest nature of reality, with whether it's deterministic or when observed as probabilistic, what does that mean for our human level of ideas of free will? Is there any connection whatsoever from this perception, perhaps illusion of free will that we have and the fundamental nature of reality?
The only thing I can say is I am puzzled by that as much as you are.
The illusion of it.
The illusion of consciousness, the illusion of free will, the illusion of self.
Does that connect to...
How can a physical system do that? And I am as puzzled as anybody.
There's echoes of it in the observer effect.
Yeah.
So do you understand what it means to be an observer?
I understand it at a technical level. An observer is a system with enough degrees of freedom that it can record information and which can become entangled with the thing that it's measuring. Entanglement is the key. When a system, which we call an apparatus or an observer, same thing, interacts with the system that it's observing, it doesn't just look at it, it becomes physically entangled with it. And it's that entanglement which we call an observation or a measurement. Now, does that satisfy me personally as an observer? Yes and no. I find it very satisfying that we have a mathematical representation of what it means to observe a system.
You are observing stuff right now.
Yeah.
The conscious level.
Right.
Do you think there's echoes of that kind of entanglement in our macro scale?
Yes, absolutely. For sure. We're entangled with, quantum mechanically entangled with everything in this room. If we weren't, then there would just, well, we wouldn't be observing it. But on the other hand, you can ask, am I really comfortable with it? And I'm uncomfortable with it in the same way that I can never get comfortable with 5 dimensions. My brain isn't wired for it.
Are you comfortable with 4 dimensions?
A little bit more, because I can always imagine the 4th dimension as time.
Without giving anything away, but the series begins with the use of quantum computers.
Yeah.
The new series begins with the use of quantum computers to simulate basic living organisms. Or actually, I don't know if it's quantum computers are used, but basic living organisms are simulated on a screen. It's a really cool kind of demo.
Yeah, that's right. They are using a quantum computer to simulate a nematode. Yeah.
So returning to our discussion of simulation or thinking of the universe as a computer, do you think the universe is deterministic? Is there a free will?
So with the qualification of what do I know because I'm a layman, right? Layperson. But
with a big imagination.
Thanks. With that qualification, I think the universe is deterministic, and I see absolutely, I cannot see how free will fits into that. So yes, deterministic, no free will. That would be my position.
And how does that make you feel?
It partly makes me feel that it's exactly in keeping with the way these things tend to work out, which is that we have an incredibly strong sense that we do have free will. And just as we have an incredibly strong sense that time is a constant, and turns out probably not to be the case. So, well, definitely in the case of time, but it's the problem I always have with free will is that it gets. I can never seem to find the place where it is supposed to reside.
And yet you explore.
But we have something we can call free will, but it's not the thing that we think it is.
But free will, so to you, what we call free will is just
what we call it is the illusion of it. And
that's a subjective experience of illusion.
Yeah, which is a useful thing to have. And it partly comes down to, although we live in a deterministic universe, our brains are not very well equipped to fully determine the deterministic universe. So we're constantly surprised and feel like we're making snap decisions based on imperfect information. So that feels a lot like free will. It isn't. It would be that's my guess.
So in that sense, your sort of sense is that you can unroll the universe forward or backward and you will see the same thing. And that notion.
Yeah, sort of. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, that notion is a bit uncomfortable to think about, that you can roll it back and forward. And
well, if you were able to do it, it would certainly have to be a quantum computer something that worked in a quantum mechanical way in order to understand a quantum mechanical system, I guess. But
and so that unrolling, there might be a multiverse thing where there's a bunch of branching.
Well, exactly, because it wouldn't follow that every time you roll it back or forward, you'd get exactly the same result.
Which is another thing that's hard to wrap a mind around. So
yeah, but that but essentially what you just described, that yes forwards and yes backwards, but you might get a slightly different result, or a very different result.
Or very different. Along the same, I think I vaguely remember you saying that the idea that there's no free will, it makes you very uncomfortable. So what do you think about free will? And from a physics perspective, from a consciousness perspective, what does it all fit?
Okay, so from the physics perspective, leaving aside quantum mechanics, we believe we live in a fully deterministic world, right?
Right.
But then comes, of course, quantum mechanics. So now we know that certain things are in principle not predictable, which as you said, I prefer, because the idea that at the initial condition of the universe, and then everything else, we're just acting out the initial condition of the universe, that doesn't.
It's not a romantic notion.
No, certainly not. Right. Now, when it comes to consciousness, I think we do have certain freedom. We are much more constrained by physics, of course, and by our past and by our own conscious desires and what our parents told us and what our environment tells us. We all know that, right? There's hundreds of experiments that show how we can be influenced. But finally, in the final analysis, when you make a life, and now I'm talking really about critical decision, where you really think, should I marry? Should I go to this school or that school? Should I take this job or that job? Should I cheat on my taxes or not? Right? These are things where you really deliberate. And I think under those conditions, you are as free as you can be. When you bring your entire being, your entire conscious being to that question and try to analyze it on all the various conditions, and then you make a decision, you are as free as you can ever be. That is, I think, what free will is. It's not a will that's totally free to do anything it wants. That's not possible.
Right. So, as Jack mentioned, you actually write a blog about books you've read, amazing books. I'm Russian, from Bulgakov to
Meister and Margarita.
Yeah. Neil Gaiman, Carl Sagan. And that choice is more powerful than any other, like, parts of our brain that we've borrowed from fish and from our evolutionary origins. Like this, whatever this crazy little leap in evolution is that allowed us to think is more important than anything else.
So I think neuroscientists pretend they know a lot more about the brain than they really do.
Yeah.
And that we know
Shots fired.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
And we don't know that much yet about how the brain functions and what's a fish and what, all this stuff. So I think what exists there is a lot of potentialities. But the beauty of the human brain is its potentialities that we have to manifest through our choices. It's there, it's sitting there. And yes, there's certain things that are going to evoke certain senses, certain feelings. I'm not even saying emotions, because I think emotions are too complex to have been programmed into our mind. But I don't think so. There's this big issue of evolutionary psychology is huge right now, and it's a big issue. I find it to a large extent as way too early, and in storytelling expo storytelling about stuff. We still don't, so for example, I would like to see if evolutionary psychology differentiate between things like inclinations, feelings, emotions, sensations, thoughts, concepts, ideas. What of those are programmed and what of those are developed and chosen and a product of reason? I think anything from emotion to abstract ideas is all chosen, is all a product of reason. And everything before that, we might have been programmed for. But the fact is, so clearly a sensation is not a product of, is something that we feel because that's how our biology works. So until we have these categories, and until we can clearly specify what is what and where do they come from, the whole discussion in evolutionary psychology seems to be rambling. It doesn't seem to be scientific. So we have to define our terms, which is the basis of science. You have to have some clear definitions about what we're talking about. when you ask them these questions, there's never really a coherent answer about what is it exactly. And everybody is afraid of the issue of free will. And I think to some extent, I mean, Harris has this, and I don't want to misrepresent anything Harris has, because I'm a fan and I like a lot of his stuff, right? But on the one hand, he is obviously intellectually active and wants to change our minds. So he believes that we have some capacity to choose. Yeah. On the other hand, he's undermining that capacity to choose by saying it's just determined, so you're going to choose what you choose. You have no say in it. There's actually no you. So it's, and that's, to me, completely unscientific. That's completely him, pulling it out of nowhere. We all experience the fact that we have an eye.
That kind of certainty, saying that we do not have that fundamental choice that reason provides, is unfounded currently.
Look, there's a sense in which it can never be contradicted because it's a product of your experience. It's not a product of your experience. You can experience it directly. Right. So no science will ever prove that this table isn't here. I can see it. It's here, right? I can feel it. I know I have free will because I can introspect it. In a sense, I can see it. I can see myself engaging it. Mm-hmm. And that is as valid as the evidence of my senses. Now, I can't point at it so that you can see the same thing I'm seeing, but you can do the same thing in your own consciousness and you can identify the same thing. And to deny that in the name of science is to get things upside down. You start with that. And that's the beginning of science. The beginning of science is the identification that I choose and that I can reason. And now I need to figure out the mechanism, the rules of reasoning, the rules of logic, how does this work? And that's where science comes from.
Of course, it's possible that science, like from my place of AI, would be able to, if we were able to engineer consciousness or understand. I mean, it's very difficult because we're so far away from it now, but understand how the actual mechanism of that consciousness emerges, that in fact, this table is not real, that we can determine that it, exactly how our mind constructs the reality that we perceive, then you can start to make interesting.
But our mind doesn't construct the reality that we perceive. The reality we perceive is there. We perceive a reality that exists.
Yeah.
And we perceive it in particular ways given the nature of our senses, right? A bat perceives this table differently, but it's still the same table with the same characteristics and the same identity. It's just a matter of, we use eyes, they use a radar system to, they use sound waves to perceive it. But it's still there. Existence exists whether we exist or not. And so you could create, I mean, I don't know how, and I don't know if it's possible, but let's say you could create a consciousness, right? And I suspect that to do that, you would have to use biology, not just electronics, but, way outside my expertise. Yeah. Because consciousness, as far as we know, is a phenomenon of life, and you would have to figure out how to create life before you created consciousness, I think. But if you did that, then that wouldn't change anything. All it would say is we have another conscious being. Cool. That's great. But it wouldn't change the nature of our consciousness. Our consciousness is what it is.
But science doesn't give.
So if we now step into, returning to our friend Sam Harris, and step into this weird place of science, and you talked about this, where the current assumption of science is it's a materialistic one. So for me, obviously, AI person, this whole mind thing is fascinating. Like, what the heck is going on up there? So how do you explain consciousness? How do you explain free will? Do you think, first of all, we have a free will? And if so, what is it?
This is where we had the debate earlier that I mentioned with Hitchens, where I think actually neither he nor the moderator understood what I was saying, which is, I'm sure, my inability to express it.
But he was very focused and delivered on the humor,
yes,
and the wit,
yes. But what I was trying to say is, if we're entirely biological creatures, if we didn't choose our genetics and we didn't choose our environment, then there is no space for free choice. I don't understand where it comes in, and I kept asking them that question, but didn't get an answer because I don't think there is an answer. I think if you're a thoroughgoing materialist, free will is impossible. There could be randomness, but randomness is not free will. It's randomness. I think you need a spiritual, non-material belief in order to get free will. And that's why I believe in free will.
Yeah, you were talking about sort of, and actually the moderator totally missed your point about the glass of water and basically what's the difference. So to you, free will, because you could also, if it fits into the materialistic picture, it could be just a convenient, useful quirk.
You would understand this better than I would. I don't understand how it could be a convenient quirk materialistically. I don't understand how to explain it.
Well, no, there's, if you study perception, there's all these kinds of illusions.
Right.
Our mind plays tricks on us.
Yes.
To make our life easier, more efficient, and survive better, and all those kinds of things. And so, the feeling like we have a choice.
Oh, that could be an illusion. Could be an illusion. That I understand. Right, but actual free choice, free will, I don't see where you get it if you're a materialist. I think you have to have a spiritual component. By the way, I think Sam would agree with this. I think he wrote about not having free will.
Yeah.
And I think if you don't have a God and you don't have a soul, that free will is a logical impossibility.
For Sam, which is fascinating, it's not just that free will is an illusion, but the illusion of free will is an illusion, meaning we don't even experience anything like it. There's no illusion. It's not even on us to be talking about it. We are like the current in the river or something. You were comparing it to the glass. We are just like that glass.
Right.
So I don't know what we're going on about with this whole free will thing. I mean, to you, is the free will the I that the young person is born with, is that somehow fundamental to religion?
It's fundamental to Judaism. I think that the idea is that you are the custodian of your soul. And even though I grant that there's a certain emphasis in modern society on the individuality of the soul, that is, we are more interconnected than I think we believe. Still, the idea that every human being is an image of God, that the human being in the Torah is created singly. And again, do I really believe there was an Adam and an Eve in a Garden of Eden? No, not literally, but I think that it expresses a deep truth